Thanks everybody for joining us. This is the afternoon session of the Urban Design and Architecture Advisory Panel for October 3rd. We're here to see our last Westport or one Westport project of the day. That's the Westport and Smith Cove Parks. I like to remind folks that while this meeting is open to the public, this is a technical design review. Any members of the public having questions or comments may email them directly to me. This is not a hearing like Planning Commission, so the panel doesn't respond directly to community comments. That said, I will drop my email in the chat and happy to take any questions or concerns that you may have. With that, I'll hand it over to the UDAAP Chair, Pavlina, and she can introduce the panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to UDAAP. We're excited to see the project development today. Before we get started, a quick introduction of the panel. With me today are Sharon Bradley, landscape architect, and Kevin Storm and Osborne Anthony, architects and planners. And I believe 3 out of 4 of us saw the initial vision plan presentation that came some time back. We're glad that everything's coming back again and it's moving forward. We did have 2 presentations this morning from the private development portion of the project. So now we understand a little bit what's happening beyond the waterfront, but we're really looking forward to seeing what is happening in your plan. I think inevitably some of the items that we were going to want to touch on in our discussion later on is the connection integration between the two. So the panel will have a much better idea of what's happening throughout the entire landscape. As a matter of just housekeeping, we have until 3 o'clock for this presentation, which actually isn't a whole lot. It goes really fast. And so what I'd like to ask is, if possible, to keep the initial presentation as short as you can, 20, 25 minutes. I will probably give you a time check at that point. And understand that we'll have a Q&A right after that, which is usually going back into the drawings and drilling on something or clarifying something. So you don't have to cover everything and anything in your presentation, just focus on the main things. And then after that, we'll have comments as well. So the quicker we can get through the front end, I think is the better, because then we'll have more time to focus on the things that are the most important. Without any further ado, please introduce your team and take it away. Thank you.
Sure, we're happy to be here. I can start. My name is Megan Bourne. I'm an associate partner at Field Operations and have been engaged and involved in work along the Middle Branch since 2019. So happy to be here. I think we presented the master plan to you all several years ago, and I'm happy to be back presenting the first capital project coming out of that master plan.
Hi there, everybody. I'm a project designer. My name is Jackson Plumley here at Field Operations, and I believe we're also joined by our colleague Josh Ketchum, who is maybe in the attendees group, but
yeah,
that's everybody from the Field Operations side.
Should we get going? We have a deck that we will share. And we will go quick. No problem, Pavlina. We're happy to go fast through this. And because we are also very excited to get all of your feedback and input on the design. So this is our site. We're working on a little bit bigger and more expansive than only the One Westport site. So we're working on this sort of corner. I would say the southwest corner of the reimagined Middle Branch kind of shoreline and waterfront areas. Just flipping back and forth between, what's there today. This is the long-term vision for the site. This is the reimagined Middle Branch plan. And so you see this being a place of development and waterfront parks and trails coming together here. Just as a very quick reminder, we had kind of 4 frameworks we were working with in the master plan about the shoreline connections, activated parks, and equitable development. And what's exciting about the Smith Cove and Westport work is it's really bringing these frameworks together and realizing them. So zooming in on the site, I think you're all very familiar with where we are. But again, we're working at what we're calling Smith Cove, which is it's the western portion of Middle Branch Park. We're looking at the One Westport development site, parcel P, the open space there, as well as a DOT-owned parcel north of that. So that area between Westport and I-95. This is a drone image we took of Smith Cove. The area is very kind of overgrown today. You can see Cherry Hill and Mount Auburn in the background. This is what the site looks like today. So it's park space. There is a boardwalk, there's an overlook, but it's quite overgrown and not in good shape. This is the One Westport site and the DOT parcel from the water. And this is breaking ground next week. One of the major challenges we face is connections. The group talked about this morning, so we won't go into detail, but this image is a kind of very visceral representation of all of those barriers between the neighborhoods and the communities and their waterfront. This is our site again. These are just the acreages and the scale of the spaces that we're working with. We're just shy of 30 acres of open space when you put all of this parkland together. And that's really the big opportunity we see with this project and why we're so excited. One of the reasons why we're so excited about it is 30 acres of open space in Waterfront Park is really significant in South Baltimore. And this connects to a much broader network of green spaces as well. And for us, the vision for this park is really threefold. It's a community destination for the people who live in Westport and Cherry Hill. It's about kind of celebrating the landscape of the Chesapeake Bay, and it's about honoring the heritage and the history of Westport and the people and the place. This is where we are in our process. We completed our 30% design documents in August. We had a kind of very long concept design process that was interrupted by the maglev hearings. We picked back up at the beginning of the year and have worked through 30% design. So we have kind of initial layouts and technical drawings that are going through a cost estimating process right now. We've also been doing a lot of public engagement, as you can see, with stakeholder workshops and public meetings. The park project is complex. It has a lot of project partners, and has stakeholders and a large design team. So there's a lot of folks involved in this project. And this is a kind of summary list. We can come back to this if you're interested, but I think the high level here is that there's a lot of different interests. There's a lot of different players, and the park is trying to mitigate and bring consensus between all of these folks in the design. That consensus building started with our stakeholder group. This is our initial visioning workshop with them back in May of 2023. We got many ideas about what should happen in this park on this site. What was very interesting was that all of this did reflect what we had heard in the master planning process. So we're getting very consistent feedback about what people want to see on site. We then did that same work with the public. This is at Westport Academy at their beautiful library. Worked with the community to ask the same types of questions. We've been out and done pop-ups. We've done engagement work at resource fairs and at parks events, asking the same types of questions. And overall, we got these sort of 6 topics or 6 priorities that people wanted to see in the park. Connectivity, number 1. Number 2, the environment and ecology. 3, access to water, being able to get to the water and interact with it. Activation in the park, so how do we create spaces and opportunities for events as well as gatherings. Recreation and play, and history and culture. So all of that comes together in our park plan. I'm not going to go through all 18 numbers here on the plan unless you would like me to, but we have zoom in plans later on in this deck. But what we're trying to indicate and show here is the general kind of layout of the park, where it is and how it's relating to the development, parcels A through F, and the connections to the communities and south to Middle Branch Park. We also are sort of, as you can see, there's some options at parcel C. We know that our partners at Kimley Horn and Stonewall are working through those options now. We have some of those options baked into our deck here as well today, just for you to be able to evaluate. The park is really the kind of basis of the park, and the framework of the park is grounded in our circulation network. Connectivity is so critical and so difficult and challenged in this part of Baltimore that creating the trail network and making sure connectivity was working was sort of paramount and number 1 for us. The network is based on the master plan, again, the kind of idea of a loop trail. This loop trail circumnavigates the heart of the Middle Branch, 3 miles. around the heart of the Middle Branch. And ideally that loop trail is a separated pedestrian and bike system with separate facilities for both of those types of users. In some areas we can't do that. We don't have enough space. So we create shared use paths. In our 30% drawings, we've sort of taken from that diagrammatic level and started to think about dimensions and materials for each of these types of trails. Here you can just start to see how that plays out. This is the separated use trail at parcel B. So this is on the waterfront looking out to the water, and you can see the pedestrian path is quite close to those row houses that are facing the waterfront park. Their lead walks connect to our pedestrian trail. And then slightly down the hill, you can see the bike trail, which is a two-way bike trail at 12 feet wide. And then you go further down to the green shoreline. Along the trail system as well are a series of features and crossings that we want to call out. One of the features is the boardwalk at Smith Cove. I also want to mention here in this image, you see these expansive wetlands. One of our project partners is Greenvest and the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative. They are designing a 5-acre stormwater wetland facility here, which you can see in this image, and we're collaborating with them on the design of the boardwalk. So this links Smith Cove to Westport with the boardwalk over the wetland, kind of hugging the shoreline edge. Here you can see a typical crossing. We've been working closely with Baltimore Rec and Parks, and one of the questions they gave us is, okay, you have these different users and ways of getting around. You need to mark the crossings with features so that you aren't going to get conflicts between users. So here you can see bollards and a change in pavement and pavement markings to start to notify people of when they need to slow down and look out around themselves on that trail system. And then at certain places, we have places to stop, get off your bike, or grab a seat and take in incredible views of the water. We're calling these balconies. We'll show you those in more detail later in the presentation. These balconies and many of the features in our park, as we mentioned before about the Chesapeake Bay landscape, we're sort of trying to, the design is really trying to evoke the piers and piles that you see across the Chesapeake Bay and sort of bring that to the park system in Westport. So you can see here, this is one of the shoreline balconies, and you can start to see that play on the pier piles and the really chunky wooden furniture and the kind of native plantings here in this image. The next layer we want to briefly touch on is park planting and ecology. We're working on sort of these, what we're calling the 5 landscapes, sort of going from the water and the shoreline, sort of upland into maritime forests. We're looking at restoring woodlands within the parks today. We want to bring native meadows to the parks, have less lawn and more sort of pollinator meadows and gardens. And we're thinking about this idea of a kind of maritime microforest. We're working within the critical area. So we've done our due diligence and homework to understand what the requirements are to work in these various areas along the waterfront, where we can and can't do things, and what it means to mitigate in this area. So our afforestation requirements are really driving some of the planting design. And so we're using these criteria and these guidelines to try and think creatively about how to think about planting design here. Something that we're excited about is the use of smaller plant material, but in large quantities and spaced close together. This is how you would plant a microforest. It's how plants want to grow. It's how they want to be out in the world if you find them in the forest naturally. And we want to try and mimic this and use this as inspiration for the planting within the park and along the trails. This is an example of that in other places, and this is really at the kind of forefront of ecological systems thinking in urban forests across the country. This is a typical section where you start to see that planting get played out, as well as how we're thinking about the shoreline. The green restored shoreline is critical to the ecology of the Middle Branch. This was, again, coming from the master plan, and now we're seeing it play out here. So how are we grading the site? How are we reinforcing the toe of the slope? What are we planting here? And what other measures are we taking to ensure that we're creating a really robust but green soft shoreline? This section starts to show you, this is at parcel B, so you can, there's a key map in the top right hand corner. You can start to see the relationship between townhome, stoop, lead walk, trails, and water lines. You can also see that our mean high water is at 2.2. I think our 100-year flood is at 7.5. So we're trying to keep our paths above those lines for future flood proofing. At the shoreline at our park space, we've widened out and made a much shallower shoreline. Here we're calling it a gravel cove. You'll see images of this later, but this is the one opportunity we have to kind of make a much bigger, more gradual shoreline, which we think is programmatically and from a design perspective quite interesting, and is also going to bring quite great ecological benefits to the park. This is a kind of inspiration image for us. This is in Seattle, but that idea of a kind of soft gravel shore is interesting to us here. And so this is an image of that at the park space in Westport. Finally, I want to just touch on the destinations within this park system. So first, talking about the trails and the planting, we're really park-wide kind of systems thinking. Now we want to zoom in and look at each of these destinations where there is a hub of programming and activity. We're going to start at Smith Cove and work our way north. We've turned our plan, so now we're looking true north as planned north. We're looking at parcel A, which is the Westport development and how it integrates into Smith Cove. A couple things to note, you're going to start to see an interplay of the trail system, of other sort of footpaths and nature paths. At number 9 is the boardwalk, which we mentioned, which connects Smith Cove to Westport. And number 4 is a building and a structure. That's really a placeholder right now. Our team through SVGP and the city are collaborating with North Bay, which is an environmental education nonprofit, and they are interested in potentially building a center here in Smith Cove. This is dependent on BCRP and the conversations there. So at the moment, we're sort of holding a placeholder there. So just think about that. We can't answer too many questions about that today, but we're holding that space for kind of future design considerations. Around there, there's sort of parking and drop off for that center, nature trails, an outdoor classroom at number 8, a picnic area at number 6. Again, sort of finding ways to gather and have smaller community events here in Smith Cove is the idea. This is the picnic area, and then this is the overlook. We're using the natural high point on site where the overlook is today, kind of opening that up, making it bigger and more accessible, and creating an outdoor classroom here. Now we're moving to the Westport Waterfront Park. So this is the space between parcels B and C, which is the larger 2-acre site for this kind of bigger public park. Starting at number 1 at the top of the screen, this is our kind of at-grade crossing. Getting people from Westport to the park is critical. So making sure that they have a safe way to cross is quite important. That's a big challenge with CSX being there, having to come under the light rail, go over the CSX lines. It's not easy. But we're proposing crosswalks there to do everything we can to get people from the neighborhood to the park. Then once we're in the park, number 2 is what we're calling the promenade or Wenburn Walk. This is trying to take the view corridor down Wenburn and just give you the most direct route out to the water. So that's a promenade. There's lighting overhead. There's benches lining this promenade. And there's a kind of clear direct extension out into a fishing pier to get you out over the water. At number 4 is an event lawn. At number 5 is nature play area, and at number 6 is the beginnings of the Black Sox Memorial. Here we're just testing the 2 ideas. I know that the team shared kind of options this morning at parcel C, so we just took those options and are starting to look at how they would fit on site. This is not yet totally coordinated. As you see, I think if this option were to play out, we would fully integrate that into the park itself. So the park would essentially grow by 30 feet here. We would rework the planting and the circulation and otherwise. And then this is just starting to look at views of the park here too. So you can see that gravel cove and that soft shoreline in the foreground, the fishing pier, the bike and pedestrian trails, Wenburn Walk heading back to the neighborhood, the nature play area, and the memorial. And then again, we're just showing the kind of options here at parcel C. A couple of views, I'm not gonna say too much here because I know we're trying to go quickly through this, but these are a few eye-level views of what the park would look and feel like across these different areas. This is not our work, this is the work of the Black Sox Memorial team, but we've been working with them to kind of integrate their thoughts and ideas about what that memorial would be. I think next steps there are to start to think about engaging an artist, doing more public engagement work here to really understand how the memorial can be cited and integrated into the park design. And then the last destination in the project is north of the One Westport site, what we're calling the Middle Branch Trailhead. So here we're extending Cloman Street into the site and creating a parking lot. From the parking lot, we have a spot to get out, take your bike out and get on the trail and take a multi-mile ride along the Middle Branch Trail. So if anyone's coming from further afield and they want to do a big ride, this is where you would start off from. You can also see here on access with Clare Street at number 4 on the plan is what we're calling the Clare Street porch. So this is a kind of landing at the end of Clare Street, something to really mark that the second at-grade crossing and access into the park. There's picnic tables, barbecues, and sort of places to gather out at the end there. At number 3, you can see one of our balconies. This balcony sits on access with the historic swing bridge and to kind of give you this fabulous view out to the old swing bridge. And you can see other sort of trail connections and the other footpaths through a sort of restored meadow at the trailhead site. This is a view of that swing bridge balcony. This is a view of the Clare Street porch. And then this is an overall aerial showing, showing the project in its totality. And that's where we'll stop. Hopefully we got through that quickly. And we're very excited to chat with you about the design.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Now take a deep breath. I really appreciate it. You ran through this. I really, really appreciate it. This was very efficient and very clear in the sense of it's great to see the overview, the beginning to end of it, because it's such a large site and there's so much going on. So now we understand the extent of it, the level of development, the updates to it to a degree from before, at least of what we could remember. So thank you for this. I think we should take a few minutes, and thank you for providing that time to now zoom in on a few things that I know the panel is really wanting to see. If you don't mind going back to your site sections. Well, first of all, let me back up and say thank you for developing all this and for the amount of outreach that has been done and for really pushing this concept forward. And what we're interested in, kind of as a part of this review, is to really start to fill in the rest of the pieces. We saw earlier the development of parcel B, C, D, F, and A, and there's sort of like, there seems to be this separation. This is what we're doing. And beyond this line, talk to those folks, right? And similarly here, there's so much resolution into the landscape, but then inside there's and then there's some buildings, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a great part of our discussion today should also be, we should spend a little bit of time to really start to make sense of all of it together. I believe that's where all teams are in. Like you've all done your job with respect to your immediate project, but I think there's these conversations that need to happen at this level that will be really, really, really important here. So those are the two parts. So as a part one, would love to zoom in and get complete picture of some of your design decisions at this point. And then on another note, we would like to pick your brain about kind of some of this additional integration. So if you don't mind going to your site sections, there were just black and white drawings showing sections through the park and then another one through the townhouses. Mm-hmm. And they were clear enough to understand kind of in totality, but I wonder if you can zoom in on just a little bit more so we can read the notes as well and give us a little bit of a kind of dimensional understanding and also conceptual understanding of the layers involved in this section. And specifically, and this is the subject that came up earlier when we were talking to especially the portion of the master plan that has changed the most with respect to typology. Yeah. Obviously, the entire north half of the site is now townhouses. And so as part of our previous discussion, we questioned this idea of like before the townhouses were in a very designated portion of the site that was always intended to be a little bit more intimate, a little bit more private, a little bit more here you move around the periphery of this. And now by virtue of this becoming all, you know, attached dwellings, whether they're stacked or single family homes, it has so much more of a private kind of experience and interface, so much so that even in your plans, all we're showing is just circulation around it. You can go bike around it and walk around it, but there isn't really any kind of a connection between it. So in a previous conversation, we were saying, how do we negotiate this very private experience of somebody's front door right there at that stoop? Something that is so is welcome to come and bike and walk right around. What are those both in terms of dimension, but also nuance of use? And particularly with this, and we want to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts on this? The concern earlier was like, is there the perception that the waterfront is more privatized, that is really just available? Yes, you can come and walk here, but you're going to have to park way over there and sort of follow like this trail. Whereas like these like 12 or 15 houses that have like the front door kind of open to it and looking into the water. So that's sort of our initial perception of it, but we're wondering kind of what are your thoughts on that, and maybe you can use the section to elaborate a little bit on it.
Sure, I'm more than happy to do that. And just a little bit, so just to sort of go back to the beginning of your question, you were asking about sort of what's here. Hopefully everyone can read what's on the screen and see this and what we're showing here. But so we sort of, there's a couple of the design constraints, I would say, that we were working with here were one, the kind of relative narrow width that we could work within, because on the one hand, you have development coming to here, and on the other hand, you have critical area setbacks coming to here. So that's why across the top of our drawing, we're trying to just play out, like, where are those areas where we cannot build? What are we working within? So there's a kind of critical area and zoning constraints. Then there's also kind of where the townhouses are going to be here. The other constraint we had was the height of where the townhouses were in elevation. I apologize if that height is not noted on this drawing, but I think it's like 12, Jackson, does that sound right?
I think it's closer to 14.
14. So we were also working with this. If you can see here, can you see my cursor, my hand on the screen? Okay. So this depth line here is the existing site elevation. And so the townhouses are set quite a bit above. And so there was a challenge of how to negotiate between where those buildings were sitting and kind of where the trail would go. And so we're having to kind of step down to make a landscape approach, rather than one option is to put a retaining wall in, right? And totally cut off the townhouses from the park. We didn't want to do that. We want to make this open and that it feels like one place. And we want to use a green landscape approach to negotiate that section rather than a gray approach, rather than the retaining wall. And I think we worked closely with Kimberly Horn and the developers here on that approach. So we're looking at the kind of elevation negotiations there, as well as the kind of constraint site. But the reality is it's a really constrained site for us. There's not a lot we can do here within this site, and we're trying to do the most we can with the kind of space that is here. And so once we get to the center of the park, we're able to kind of spread out a little bit and do more in those areas. I think with that said, I think your question of public and private, I think, it goes both ways. We think about, on the one hand, having townhouses face the trail is a good thing. It's eyes on the street, it's eyes on the trail. It will animate the trail, it brings people to the trail, and there's gonna be a feeling of kind of safety and security that brings. That's very good. It's gonna feel urban because you have folks living right there. On the other hand, I agree that there is a sense of, how do we not make that feel private, right? What can we do here so that that's not the case? I think the way that we are trying to do that in our design is by creating these features and these stops along the trail so that folks are, when they're in the park, they're excited to get to the Clare Street porch. There's something else there. There's a piece of program or activation there that draws them through the park to get to that destination. It's a lot like designing a linear park in that way, where you're trying to have, you know, certain continuous elements that are quite strong, like the trail is here, and then break that up with features and destinations that create a kind of episodic journey for you along that trail. So hopefully that kind of helps unpack that a bit. Happy to continue if there's other questions people have.
Yeah, certainly. It helps us understand how you're looking at it and what conversations you've had with others and how you're navigating kind of this relationship. So to that end, help us understand where it says bicycle path, is that, and you had another diagram that showed how much of it is shared and how much is shared. So is that just a bicycle path or is it also a pedestrian one? Because then the pedestrian one is on the private parcel.
Yes, yeah. So the pedestrian trail is on the private parcel, which is here, pedestrian path by others. And then the bicycle trail is this one here. So if we went back to that, if we want to go back to that diagram, the yellow in the diagram is this we would consider a separated use facility because we have the pedestrian path and then we have the bicycle path and they're separate. For the boardwalk, for instance, we don't have two boardwalks. We're combining those together here in the design. So you would have pedestrians and cyclists together on the boardwalk.
Yeah, we'll go back and look at that plan just so that we can understand the extent of it. But before we do that, just so we understand clearly, this experience that you are on a trail kind of within a landscape is really only happening on the bicycle path in this particular condition, because the pedestrians will really be walking in front of the stoops. I mean, the experience of the waterfront for the pedestrian is actually the one there on the right-hand side in front of the townhouses. And the experience of kind of within a landscape is really on the bicycle path. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's fair. And I think I will say that we did, in our design work, we tested a lot of different sections here. Like we explored many options. There was an option where we kept a narrow sidewalk next to the townhouse. We added another pedestrian trail and a bike path. So we looked at an option where there were kind of 3 parallel places to walk or bike, right? So we were adding an additional one. It felt redundant. And with the space we had, it was a lot of paving and a lot less green. So we did those explorations in looking at that. The other thing that it's difficult to see in this view, but that pedestrian path where it sits and within the grade, it kind of can come up and down and helps us negotiate grades as well, kind of in 3 dimensions. I know that that's not easy to see here in this section, but it is.
Yeah, I think we understand it, but help me understand also, why is it important to have a pedestrian path on the private property in front of the townhouses as opposed to within the park and on the trail? Like, I'm even questioning whether, I don't understand how you even have 3, but I'm questioning whether you need 2. Do you know what I'm asking? I'm asking you, like, why is it essential that there is a pedestrian path in front of those rows of houses as a matter of like the park experience, as opposed to it being in the landscape kind of on the lower level?
I guess in our mind, you would need access to those townhouses regardless. Like there would be some kind of, like those stoops would be leading out to a lead walk regardless. So there would be a sidewalk there, right? Whether it was in the park or not. And I think this is a way for us to, yeah, I guess I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
Maybe Pavlina, if I can just weigh in very briefly.
Yes, please go ahead.
So conceivably, you ran your cursor across the dash line, which represents the existing grades, right?
Yep.
Where your cursor is now is supposedly the pedestrian path.
Yep.
Why couldn't that pedestrian path be adjacent to the bike path and the sloped 1 and 3 move back towards the townhome stoops?
Oh, I guess then the lead walks from the townhome stoops they would be longer to get
They
down.
would, they would figure out a way to negotiate a path down to the pedestrian path.
I see.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, that's part of the question, but I know what Pavlina is getting at. You
Yeah,
can, sorry,
we'll get
Pavlina.
to it. We just try to understand. That's why it's all questions. Don't take it anyway. I think we're thinking
Yeah.
ahead because it's along the lines of comments. So we can pause. Thank you, Osborne, for clarifying it. But I think he's thinking about the same things. We'll get back to this so that you can understand kind of what we're thinking with respect to it. It's all about this public-private thing and just pushing for clarity and for people to know their place. You will know, you'll see where we're coming from here in a minute. Thank you for clarifying that. I think it was really important to zoom in and see how much indeed we're pushing from the water, right? There's like all kinds of buffers and like all of that literally puts the line. You can't go any further to the left, right? And then naturally there's the same thing happening on the right-hand side. So it's important for us to understand the limitations, which we now do. So thank you. Let's do a similar thing with your other section, just so that we can zoom in a little bit more and see, like, again, dimensionally and in terms of these different zones. We see with the dash lines here on the left where kind of the floodplains are pushing your kind of like little wall all the way there. So really that's kind of like this gravelly landscape that allows for the webs and the flow of the waterscape to come through. And then if we can pan to the right, walk us through sort of the rest of the thinking, please, in dimension.
Sure, this way into the.
Mm-hmm.
So here.
Oh, that's the end of this drawing. Maybe there was another one because it was showing more, I thought. Maybe not.
Oh, here, let me zoom out one more time. So this section is really just at the shoreline.
Okay.
But we could find others, but really here, yeah, you're right. So in the park, and we have like a 3D aerial image of this that shows this area as well, but to the right here where my cursor would be the lawn, would be the sloped lawn. At the base of the kind of toe of that lawn is the bicycle trail. And then we have a gabion wall that could be a kind of seat wall there, which is the edge, and then to the gravel cove. And then we would have our very shallow sloping gravel cove moving down into the water. Today, actually, what's interesting is we will be excavating this area out. There is a kind of berm here that's heavily planted and it blocks all the views of the water in the park. So we don't want to keep that because we want the park to have the big open, beautiful views of the water. So we are sort of modifying that slope and moving that earth around to use that in other places for earthwork within the park. And this becomes this gentle slope.
Understood. Oh yeah, thank you so much. It's nice to see it, to understand sort of the modification of it, and the fact that it becomes a lot more gradual, softer, and sort of it takes a lot of the movement of water. Thank you. This is very, very, very clear now. I'm going to pause my questions here. I know that the rest of the team will have other specific drawings they want to zoom in, but this covers some of the initial kind of let's read this a little bit closer. Let's see, Osborne, since you've already chimed in, what are your questions for the team? What else do we want to look at?
Yeah, along those lines, it seems as though something is emerging that I must ask the question. I mean, and it's probably in 2 parts. Is there some kind of reason the public isn't necessarily allowed to engage the water?
Yes. The water quality of the Middle Branch today is not safe for swimming.
Well, not to swim, but at least walk next to it, adjacent to it.
Yeah. So there are places within the design where we're encouraging people to walk next to it, such as at the boardwalk and that marsh area. We're trying to keep out of the floodplain with our trails, so we are lifting higher than where the shoreline is. But I think that's a great point. Another issue, like we saw a constraint, is that we sort of need to get up and high anyways. We talked about the elevations, but there are key points where we This is one of them where people may be able to get closer to the water, but there is this real tension, I would say, Osborne, of do we want to encourage people? Do we want to overtly encourage people to get to the water or not because of the state of the water quality today? This is a big question. We've heard from many people and a lot of pushback that no, it's not safe to be close to the water, so the design should not encourage folks to and invite folks to get close to the water.
Except that I thought I saw a very important portion of your program central to all of the site is a fishing pier.
Yep.
So what are we thinking?
I know. I mean, that's part of the tension too. I would say, Osborne, that that the water quality is not good. I would say a big, however, culturally and socially, there are a lot of people who fish around the Middle Branch. There are a lot of members of the community who are out every day fishing. And we heard this and so there's this tension playing out for us in the design of, do we want to support those communities and those members of the community who are activating and bringing life to the park every day? Do we want to support them? Do we want to take on what the public is asking to sort of have a fishing pier here? Or do we need to step back and not allow people to do that? So we are, and it's imperfect, but we are trying to strike a balance in the design of acknowledging sort of safety issues with getting close to the water not being super clean, with the kind of social and cultural desires of the people in the communities to be on the water and to fish here and to be next to the water. So I agree, it's totally imperfect and would love to continue the conversation. We're trying to do a little bit of both, and it is imperfect.
Okay. And then one other question, I think on a site plan, you indicated a connection back to, is it Swan Park? How is that being made?
Was that the very early green diagram, Osborne,
Okay.
in the deck?
Yeah, it was early, yes.
Okay. So that is a future project, not within our contract. Let me see if I can find it. Yes, this one here, right?
Yep.
So within the master plan, we proposed an east-west pedestrian bridge that would connect Westport to Swan Park and Baltimore Peninsula. That bridge is not a part of this project, but that is a part of the general sort of master plan. So like these green connections, I would say, are not specifically a part of this project. They're outside our project boundary, but they're let's say the desire lines going back to the master plan about how this site would link and connect to other places around the Middle Branch.
So you're acknowledging it so that it's understood that you're not precluding the future connection. I think that's what you suggested.
Exactly. And then what we're trying to do within our site boundary is make sure, like at the Clear Street porch, let's make sure there's room and space there that does not prevent a future bridge and connection from coming in and landing there.
Got it. And then one final question. So the extent of your scope does not reach Floman, with the exception of the parks that kind of extend up that way, right? Or are you responsible for conceiving or conceptualizing the crossing as well? The crossing from Pullman to the communities to the west.
So we are sort of advocating for that crossing, but the Cloman Street design is being done under a different contract with a different set of designers.
Got it. All right, thank you. You'll hear in my comments, I think there's a contradiction in your design related to the bike paths and the pedestrian paths, but I'll make those comments eventually. I think in part that's what Pavlina may have been alluding to. So.
Thank you, Osborne, for your questions. We'll come back with comments shortly. Kevin, what are your clarifying questions for the team?
Most of them were taken by the section discussion, so thank you for that. But I do have a question, maybe, and apologies if I missed any of this in your presentation, but could you just talk a little bit about integration of sort of welcoming and supporting amenities like where like like frequency of like benches and bike storage or public restrooms, I think are a big one. And also I guess as a follow-up to that, was there ever any discussion about integrating some sort of any sort of small scale retail kiosk or something for small coffee stand or something in the park to kind of give people an invitation to stop and relax and enjoy?
Let me just, Kevin, pull up the plan to talk that through. So, so questions about, we could start with furnishing. We have furnishing, so we have sort of noted where our moments of sort of pause are along the trail. There's a kind of picnic area here, the outdoor classroom, the benches throughout the park space here along Wenburn, along the edges of the lawn, through the garden space and in the play space. And then here along the trail at the balconies at 13 and at 14 at the Clare Street porch. And then there's another one here, which we failed to put a 13, that dot on there is another spot to kind of rest. With benches, and then you come around to the trailhead, there's a series of benches and furnishing there. Also throughout the plan, there are bike racks. There's a cluster of them here at the trailhead, knowing people are sort of getting on and off the trailhead here, as well as at the kind of entrance of the park back here on Cloman Street, and then a number clustered here at number 3 in Smith Cove Park. Lighting, we are proposing lighting the trail here, as along the sort of loop trail itself, and then within the 2-acre park space in the center. In terms of other types of amenities, so there's sort of picnic areas, right? We talked about barbecue spaces here, larger picnic tables back here at number 3, and the furnishing at the outdoor classroom, which we think is a kind of multi-purpose community space too, that could be used by kids as well as seniors and sort of other groups. At the 2-acre park in the center, there is the nature play space, which is really a kind of family amenity. What am I missing here? Restrooms. I think restrooms is a great question. We've heard that from a number of our key stakeholders, and we heard it at our last public meeting. I think, to be frank, right now the budget for the park would make restrooms quite challenging to fit that amenity in. But because we heard it from our stakeholders, because we heard it from the public, in our next phase of design, we're really going to think hard and explore whether or not that's a possibility that can be included. And then in terms of retail, we haven't talked about retail in the park. What we have thought about is food trucks where they could come in and park. One here is at 14, kind of at the end of Clare Street, sort of leaving a larger paved area at the mouth of the park almost, for a kind of area for food trucks. And then at number 10, we have street parking here, and we could do food trucks there as well, depending on the day. And so trying to keep things flexible, knowing it's very difficult to, usually kiosks like that need to be subsidized to remain in place. That's a larger operations and maintenance question. But yeah, so that's kind of where we are with amenities. I'll say one more thing. We've been in conversations since the completion of 30% design with our stakeholder group. There's also been conversations about kayaks, and could we do a kayak rental service? Could we work with, let's say, the Canton Kayak Club or something similar to that, and do something here at the center of the park to offer kind of the gravel cove is a very easy in and out with a kayak. So could we do that here and add that amenity into the park as well? So we're going to be.
Yeah, that was my next question actually. So you just got it. I was just wondering if there's any other in-water activation besides the fishing. That's an interesting. So thank you. Those are my only questions.
Thank you, Kevin, very much. Sharon, what are your questions for the team?
Thank you. Just a few. You talked about these great native plant areas and the forests and so forth that you'll be creating. And question is part of this project a set of maintenance guidelines to control invasive species and weeds and so forth that are going to want to volunteer themselves there?
Yes, we are in our next phase of work, we will be including a maintenance and operations consultant and specialist on our team who will be, their job is to put together and assemble that maintenance plan. There is an agreement, like within the park MOU agreement between Stonewall, the developer, SBGP, and the city and the local Westport CEDC, there is no maintenance agreement so that there is sort of maintenance paid for and understood to be paid for by the development led by SBGP for the next, for the first 10 years of the park's life. So I think both in terms of kind of understanding that budget and how it's going to play out, though the outlines of that are set up within that MOU, and then our team will be responsible for putting that maintenance, those maintenance guidelines together for those crews to play out.
Great. And presumably that would have to include removal of the invasive species that are there now, which obviously have to be in some of those areas. Okay, great. If you could go back to that section that Pavlina was talking about with the townhouses and the pedestrian walk and the bike path, something that we saw this morning was a notation that the townhouses were observing a critical area buffer of 55 feet. And I see a 100-foot critical area buffer here. Does it vary that much? And if so, what happens in that 55 narrower area?
The 55, Sharon, may be, it may be the W2 zoning setback. So our site sits within both the critical area as well as the Baltimore City W2 zoning overlay. So we are looking at both of those set of regulatory guidelines as we design here. So I would assume that 55 is related to the zoning setback rather than the full 100-foot critical area buffer.
Right, and that was my assumption at the time, but they actually showed a dimension of water's edge to first townhome, 55 feet. The same thing that we're looking at here being shown as 55 feet, not 100 feet. So I'm confused about that discrepancy between, and it may be more a question for them than for you.
My guess, Sharon, my guess is this might be, and I think it is a question for that team, but I think what my guess might be is if we look at my key plan up here, there are some areas in front of C through F where the shoreline is eroded and we get what we're calling kind of pinch points. If you can see, let me just like zoom in and hopefully you can see it on that map. But you can see that it varies along this edge of kind of where there might be a pinch point in some of these zones versus where you have a wider space at the waterfront. And I would imagine that 55 foot is potentially at one of these two pinch points here in front of C through F.
Okay, and in those situations, your section would look quite different then.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
It becomes more constrained.
Yes. Okay, and one of the questions I had, I think you answered with Osborne's question, is you don't really introduce people to be at the water's edge. The closest looks like maybe the gravel cove where that's, you don't go onto the gravel area.
Correct.
But you see it on the path. Okay, I see. Okay, and this is not, I mean, it's so difficult to separate the issues between the townhouse development and yours. So do you happen to know the width? Because you do have the section here, this pedestrian path by others, what the width of that path is?
8 feet.
It's 8 feet? Okay. All right. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. I only had a couple more. If you don't mind, on the larger plan, it's showing a connection to parcel A. Can you please elaborate a little bit on how you're connecting to that parcel?
Yeah, maybe I can show you on the zoom in plan.
Sure.
That might be an easier place to see. So we have a few elevations noted here on the plan, and that is to sort of underscore how steep this slope is. We have to go from 5 elevation where the boardwalk is up to 33, which is where the parcel A sits. So we're at a very steep slope and pretty intense climb to get up that hill. So, and we are also in a sort of critical area zone where clearing a lot of the existing trees is not wanted from a critical area perspective. So we're trying to keep a fairly small, tight footprint here. But we do know that we do want to connect from parcel A to the waterfront. So we have included a stair here with an overlook. So right around where it says elevation 33 and at number 10, we have a stair that comes down and connects from parcel A to the boardwalk. There's a small overlook at the top of that stair, a landing at the midpoint, and then you come down, there's a larger landing close to the boardwalk, and then you connect into the boardwalk. The other places to get to, how to get to parcel A from our site, you can also see at number 11, if you walk further down the Cloman Street sidewalk and then turn towards the waterfront, you can walk along the townhouses at parcel B and then link into the shoreline trail there as well. Because certainly this, the stair is not ADA accessible, but this, I believe that this route at number 11 is ADA accessible.
Yeah, thank you for this. What is the estimated elevation of the building? I know it's hypothetical, numbered number 4. What's the elevation there? Is that still 33 or lower?
I think that's lower, but we have our like model right here.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is I'm guessing that from that +5, if we're taking the path that's numbered 9, shared use boardwalk, I imagine that one is ADA. So the slope, it slopes up to a degree, but so I'm trying to figure out if there's another connection to the left of the plan here to parcel A. So instead of it being right there at the steepest of points, if there's a way of connecting and looping it on the side, but that, you know, that will be a question comment later. So that's why, that was my question about the elevation on this side. So, okay, great. I just wanted to understand what you're thinking about in this area right now. Thank you so much.
I think, Paulina, one more note there. And we could share a technical drawing here. I wish we had our contours on this map so you could see, but if you can follow my line, my cursor here, this is also a low point.
Yeah.
So
it's like a ravine, right?
Yes.
It's like it
so,
dips.
Yes. So we did study and explore that as well, sort of, but it becomes challenging to kind of traverse over that ravine and get back up to the high point at parcel A. Yeah.
Okay. Understood. Thank you very much. Well, we need to jump into comments so we can use the rest of our time well. I'd like to start with Osborne. Osborne, what are your comments for the team?
Yeah, if it's okay, I just have one very important question to ask, and I'll jump right into the
Yeah,
comments. If you recall on this section, I'm trying to understand where exactly, what's the natural water line? And where exactly is the tidal water line? Does that come all the way up to the bike path, or does that top off at the top of the riprap wall?
Let's go back. We have those marked in this section, so we can show those to you. So here, Osborne, oh no, I was trying to zoom in. Okay.
You just give me an idea. I mean, is it, yeah.
So mean high water is 2 plus 2.2. 100-year flood is 7.5. And our bicycle path ranges, it kind of goes up and down. The lowest point is remains, I think is at like +8, so that we're above the 100-year flood elevation.
Wonderful. All right, thank you so much. If you can just jump back to a site plan, I think I can probably get through a comment or two pretty quickly. So I think when I kind of look at this, initially when you did, your layout, the presentation, et cetera, it was done very well, and I'd be quite frank, I'm extremely interested and impressed at this site and the kind of a robust framework that your team has kind of mapped out to really deal with the challenges along the shoreline and potentially create a framework or basis by which the other development teams can come and stitch their parcels into what you're doing. So I think in that regard, I commend you highly. But as always, you've heard the saying, the devil is in the details, right? And, so is God. So as we kind of zoom in and we look at this, we become a little bit more critical, not in a bad sense, but in a curious sense as to how things actually work, how things come together, and why decisions are being made. And I think you've been very forthright in terms of explaining that to us, and I really appreciate that. But as always, as we zoom into any portion of this plan, there are things that still need to be resolved. What I will say, though, I'll first start with the things that I think are meaningful and done well. The fact that you've identified destinations and you've carefully positioned those destinations, not just based on where they are on the site, but you've integrated the natural landscape into that. For instance, the marshlands, the tidal marshlands, everything that's occurring to the left of the screen, which I guess is to the south, as well as the park to the north, and how you've begun to integrate that and use it to the benefit of the project, but at the same time respecting um, the natural landscape. I think what these destinations begin to do is not just apply points of interest, but they begin to anchor the project overall, particularly the one to the north, although it's much smaller. You can actually see how you're kind of integrating access back to the greater community by introducing that parking area and so forth and so forth. And then on the more granular level, as you kind of go along the water's edge, you're introducing this kind of a concept of the porches. And the porches seem to be strategically located either as anchors or punch points to key vistas or streets that punch through the sites, or potentially points of interest, such as the swing bridge. And I really love that touch. I think it's elegant. I think there's a kind of a quality that it creates that I can clearly see in the future. It becomes another site where a lot of pictures would be taken from, right? So I think in that regard, it's thoughtful and it's very intentional. Similarly, at Wenburn, the fact that you're anchoring that street with such a prominent park, I think it really begins to make sense. I think where there's still a lot of work to be done is the umbilical cord that runs along the water's edge that begins to connect these destinations. And I don't know if it's a challenge that's solely within your camp, or it's really within the camp of the development groups of parcels A, C, D, and F, and even B, certainly B. But I think it's a combination of decisions that will be made. And somehow these row houses are turning out to be more, and I'll be unfair, problematic, right, than intended. I think it's a wonderful touch to any development, but I think it needs another level of thinking, and another level of thinking that begins to integrate and better better showcase how the relationship between the townhouse, where it's located, and everything that's occurring along the water's edge. So one of the reasons that section kind of garnered such attention, obviously, is because of the whole private public issue. And I'm not going to go into that. I'm sure the other panelists will speak to that. But I'll just point out that if I'm spending a lot of energy and effort to come to the water, whether I can get into the water or not, I want to be as close to the water as possible. You know, I may have a young child who's having their first experience, engaging the waterfront. And yes, they may not be able to get into the water, but there's a certain kind of an experience, a connection by being able to walk along that water as close as possible and really feel the benefits of that. Instead, what we've done is we've taken the bike lanes, the bike trail, and we now have the bike trail fronting the water's edge. Bikes move a lot faster than pedestrians. And I'm wondering, I don't know if it's deliberate that you did this or it's something that's unintentional or unintended, but I would ask you to investigate that a little bit further, simply because I think there's more benefit to having the pedestrians walk along the water and figuring out another way to accommodate the bikes. Now, I can see in part what has happened. You've kind of located the pedestrian walkway adjacent to the row homes because there's a benefit to that. There's kind of an access condition that needs to be resolved there. But I think in the process of doing that, you're reinforcing a point that Pavlina made earlier today at an earlier review. You're not necessarily being truthful to the public. In essence, you're creating this kind of a semi-private condition, which creates an unintended situation. And I just believe that more than anything else, that's the most telling piece about this whole Westport design. The fact that it just seems as though uh, not much is given to the public in terms of their ability to get to the water. And you're seeing it showing up in many different ways. I think those are my general comments. I think overall, I can clearly see the team is competent and you folks are really making a concerted effort to improve the conditions in this area. And I just believe that you need to continue collaborating with the other development teams to really figure out a way to resolve that kind of a cross-sectional condition that extends between each of the destination points. I'll pause there, Pavlina. Thanks.
Thank you, Osborne. I'll come back around and see if anything else comes up after we hear from the rest of the panel. Kevin, what are your comments for the team?
Thanks, Pavlina. First, I want to compliment the team on the work. I feel like it's just really, I feel like Westport's in very good hands with you all at the helm on this, and it's very thoughtful from everything from the Chesapeake Bay design nods to the way you've kind of gone through this very, clear methodology about your approach, and it all seems in many ways to come together. I think that my small bits of constructive criticism are a little bit more focused at not necessarily like they're more about the parameters within the ones that you're working. I really dislike seeing this like hard line drawn between like the private and public. I mean, what you're designing is really what we're supposed to be designing here is the public realm, which is both public and private. So I would encourage whoever can influence the people that make these decisions that you should most definitely be designing your park up to the face of the townhouses. I think you should be tasked with looking at those little moments where the east-west roads puncture the townhouses and sort of enter onto the public portion of the park. But those are just probably as important as like the balconies along that you have on the other part of the project. And so understanding how those and if handled well, which I'm sure you would do, really might help mitigate a little bit of that tightness and that feeling of that the feeling that everyone's obviously feeling concerned about the privateness of having the townhouses so close. And then to take it further, I mean, I think you should be looking at the east-west streets all the way back to Pullman, because as they're drawn now, there's not a lot of, real, I think, nuanced thought in them. And I think that probably the east-west streets might have a slightly different section and character than the north-south streets, because you're kind of framing views or maybe sloping differently. And it just seems like understand that this public realm framework in its entirety is sort of like a critical thing. And because there are these, 3 or 4 teams with great designers working on all of them, I just wish there was some way to encourage like a kind of a unification thread or something that where everything kind of comes together. And I think, you know, Cloman Street too, like it just should be this beautifully designed street with, you know, that'll influence how, you know, we went as in our earlier group that we met with, it'll influence the edge of Cloman on parcel A, which right now is really kind of falling short and ultimately really needs to kind of, you know, help tie everything together, especially with given that everything here is kind of an island kind of cul-de-sac situation. So anyways, I guess I don't know if it's we can ask the planning staff to encourage the various groups to kind of come together and maybe encourage field operations scope to kind of creep up into the project or work with whoever else is working on those pieces alongside them. However, it needs to get done, but it just seems like that would it's just a real missed opportunity at this point. And I'm sure you'll have some very clear thoughts about like, you know, how long should that pedestrian, how wide should that pedestrian path be? Like what in the parks that you've worked on, what are the best practices for, you know, distance between the edge of that sidewalk and the first house to provide the right amount of, you know, privacy and stormwater management and graciousness for all of those. So I think that to me, like those details are really, really important. So that's one thing. And then I asked about the bathrooms. I do think like the dignity with which we allow like citizenry to engage in our public spaces is like that, you know, public restrooms are just kind of like a very baseline thing. I know this is not necessarily in your control or your decision, but again, I think that it's good to hear that you've heard this in your public feedback so far. But I think, you know, providing the basic necessities, that's the first step in actually inviting people to participate, as I'm sure you know, and just welcoming everyone, you know, to feel comfortable there. So I think that's just something that, you know, really needs to, you know, be drilled in on pretty hard. I think these are kind of a little bit random thoughts in one way, but I think we touched on this, but I think drawing your sections at the tightest point is actually critical too. That came up with Sharon's question about the 50 feet, just to make sure that you're comfortable with that, with those dimensions, that it can actually work. I think you showed an option 1 and option 2 for the north side of your central park. I don't know how panels feel, but I think I really prefer the one you're showing now, where it's that more asymmetrical balance, where the roadway doesn't come in front on the north side and it does on the south side. It's kind of interesting in balance and kind of, you know, it creates that separation effect from the townhouses. It also eliminates like a weird dead end road that people might be doing like 6 coin turns trying to back up if they've taken a wrong turn. And let's see, I think I'll stop there. I can go into this a bit. I really like the direction it's going. I just think that you've heard from us all pretty loud and clear that there's some concern around those kind of really thin pitch points, and then you know, and yeah. Anyways, I'll pass it on to Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin, very much. Sharon, what are your thoughts on the project so far?
Thanks, Marlena. People use the word transformative too often, but I think this really does have the opportunity to be incredibly transformative here at Middle Branch. And so you can see the components developing beautifully here. So very exciting to see. And you can especially see it at the northern and southern points. You can see how that has a great opportunity to be the success that we're all envisioning here. The part where I am most worried about is that middle piece. And we've all talked about it a lot, and at the risk of being repetitive, I really feel like where those two pieces come together, your edge and parcels B and C through F, is where it could break down potentially, and how what you've developed at the northern and southern ends could start to erode, and that character could really start to erode and come apart, and not achieve the intentions that are clear here. So I do think that the lead walks we looked at on that section, that the lead walks coming to that collector path, it truly is a collector path at a set of townhomes. It does not feel, I think it cannot feel, you know, despite your best efforts, like a park pathway. It's the collector path for a set of townhomes. And so I don't think there's any getting around that. And again, that's other side of your property line. But that's where, you know, as Osborne and Kevin and Pavlina have all pointed out, you know, that level of coordination has to happen. And I don't know how it happens, but I feel like it has to for the success of that middle piece. Otherwise, those intentions of that beautiful linking piece between the north and south will really not happen. Not for the pedestrian anyway. I could see it being successful for the cyclists, because you do have that vertical separation, and I think that can be very successful. And it may be that the answer is that that's a shared path. That you showed that magenta at the southern piece. It may be that it all has to be a shared path, because in order to bring the pedestrians into the park and away from the townhouses, I think it's the only way it's going to feel like a park amenity and not just a part of the townhouse community. So that might be the answer. And I think, given the length of this and the nature of it, it's not a high-speed throughway for cyclists anyway. So it would be what I would think of as a recreational bike path, not a Tour de France training ground, as some people treat some bike paths. So, and in that case, pedestrians and cyclists can share the path. So it might be more of what we're looking at is a slower paced shared pathway throughout that can truly draw people into the park. Let's see. And then the only other thought I had was this idea of connection to the water or not connection to the water. And I absolutely hear what you're saying about that tension, and perhaps that's two separate sets of plans. One is what can happen now safely, and what are the aspirations for the future, and here's how you could do it. How do we bring people to the water? Can kids throw rocks in the water and learn to skip stones in the water, fish safely in the water and draw fish out that are safe to eat? But I feel like this conflicted middle ground where we're not going to bring people to the water to swim in it or even touch it, but we're going to allow them to fish in it and pull fish out and eat it. That's a mixed message. And so I love the idea of Middle Branch someday being clean enough, and that can be a goal, that is a measurable goal for the city to follow. When it reaches this grade, like we grade our waterways, then we can build this fishing pier and we can invite people in the gravel cove to throw rocks in the water and participate. But I feel like that has to be clarified one way or the other. And I believe that's the only set of comments I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, very much. I have, a few items to address as well. And I will also echo everyone's comments about the very thoughtful approach to this. I think there were elements that were put in the DNA of the project when we first saw it as a big vision plan that is still here, and that are kind of these really important pieces that hold everything together. I think the nuances of things are actually probably the most important thing here, because once you get the big moves down, it's really that next layer of development on that finer scale, especially in these very compressed spaces where the project really needs to continue to succeed. But I do want to start a little bit with this larger scale, kind of looking at it overall. And I already mentioned earlier, one of my first observations was that, kind of what we're calling the trail and the bike path and the portion of sort of public experience within the park is really in these like large loops around the private development parcels. And I think from the very beginning and in the vision plan, and then even in the development drawings that we saw earlier, everyone keeps talking about connectivity, right? And it's as if we're saying, yeah, this is a very connected plan, but at the same time, we keep drawing things that aren't connected. From the vision plan till now, till we saw it, there's still this one connection to the west, and even that one is outside of your scope, right? And then we've talked about kind of the development, and even in the previous master plan, when this was all a mixed use thing, we talked about reinforcing these connections between the development and the waterfront, right? And now we're sort of back to just a single loop, and then everything inside of it is sort of like a block. Right now, we're really depending on these east-west little cuts between the row houses to really create any kind of connectivity, even within it. So I think that being one of the main goals of things, I don't think that the plan is achieving on so many different levels in terms of the quality of the experience, in terms of the new programming that's going to happen, the ability to even just use it as a public amenity is increasing manifold. but we're not yet succeeding on the connectivity piece. And I don't, this is not a criticism to you as design team or to anyone individually involved here when it comes to the private developers or the city's involvement and all of that. I think the reason why it's not achieving yet is because we haven't connected the dots between everybody. I think there's things waiting to happen, and they can and they should happen in order for all of this to really, so that then we can actually sit back and say and look at the plan and go like, yes, we have made it as connected as it possibly can be. And there's all of these different ways for people to access things. And we've done it in a thoughtful and coordinated way. So I think that's really what we're focusing on here, is to make sure that beyond the big pieces, some of these goals that we've established and that we know are really important to the project, we actually are following through. And so from that point of view, I think we have a little bit of an issue here because, you know, while it appears that, you know, the waterfront townhouses, the ones that are on that first row or close to the water, have a direct access to what is currently in this drawing, our trail or our promenade. I mean, they just have a little walkway at grade that puts them straight onto that experience. That isn't necessarily the case for the rest of the plan that, you know, sort of has to, you know, move through, you know, driveways and parking lots and like stuff like that to get to it. And it really gets even a little bit worse when you look at parcel A, which also happens to be affordable housing designated site, that doesn't even have a direct, you know, ADA access. And as we reviewed this morning, it's senior housing, you know, so people with limited mobility will not be taking those stairs. So then they will have to go to Cloman and then around and in front of more row to relieve and so I think there's that's the concern on the comments that we offered earlier in terms of this perceived privatization of the work. How can like those 30 row houses have such a direct and immediate access to the waterfront, not just by virtue of views, but even just proximity, accessibility, and that immediacy? And then there's like a portion of the site that has actually pretty high density, does not at all. And we're saying this with the ultimate appreciation for, I mean, the site, there's nothing you can do about the fact that the designated site is surrounded by a ravine that's 30 feet deep. We completely understand that. It's not like, oh, there's a solution, you're just not doing it. No, this comment is not about that, but it is about appreciating the fact that, you know, we're working within a site that is so challenged that even with the greatest kind of attitude towards providing equity throughout it, there's significant challenges to overcome when it comes to that. And I just want it to be stated and appreciated and part of our discussion as we keep moving forward. And in terms of really making sure that this amenity that's being provided is really equitable and available, even for the people that are already there, just, you know, east of Cloman. So I think that's a really important thing to consider and as an overlay. And really, I ask you to put that lens on. And I know you're thinking through it all the time, but it is very, very obvious right now. And part of it is beyond your control. It's the fact that all of the north parcels turned into kind of a more private typology as opposed to the mixed use one that had the opportunity to have commercial experiences and more shared programming on the first floor, which naturally integrates with a public park a little bit easier. So that is also not in your control, but it is something that now you have to adapt to. So in other words, if it was working before when the program on these parcels was different, we can't necessarily take the same approach because it doesn't work the same way now that they're not. So those are the kind of things to think about kind of from that equity and accessibility perspective. So with that in mind, I just want to share some of the thoughts that came up earlier when we were reviewing parcel CD&E, and I want to relate it to your design here. Because we hadn't seen and heard kind of specifically what you've done, so we were really working with what was shared earlier. The concern was that the city is investing into this wonderful waterfront experience that really, you know, has engaged the community, is really hopefully going to be enjoyed not just by these few parcels, of course, but the neighborhoods around it. And it's a significant investment, and it has been such a long time coming. You've been on it from 2019. I have been following this site since 2002 and 3, right?
Yeah.
So, and so has the rest of the city. I mean, this is it. And, you know, what we were mentioning to the developers earlier was like, is this the best and highest use after all these years? And I understand that right now the market may not be taking things, but then is there a phasing involved? Okay, right now build as many townhouses as you can, but reserve certain parcels perhaps that can bring more density later and be more, so the development can be more robust. So the conversation was the city is investing into all of this amenity, and you know that is what it's offering to this, to these parcels, to this development. Here's this wonderful newly built waterfront park that you're within 5 feet of, right? And then the reciprocity of it, like, okay, here's some townhouses. The point that we're trying to make here is that there's a synergy and there is a kind of coexistence of the two. Like there's no waterfront park experience that is successful without the neighborhood and the community around it actually being robust, vibrant, and offering programmatic things that strengthen it, and vice versa. So again, all that is a long way to say there's nothing you can do about what ends up being built on there, but there's so many things in the design that should be done that really start to anticipate that. So if we can go to the section now, but in front of the row houses, I want to share with you some of the concerns that we explained earlier, kind of from the development perspective, but now from the park perspective as well. I think the idea is that everything should feel integrated and continuous. Like Kevin is saying, like that separation between public and private should not be reading in the ground, right? In other words, you know, great urban spaces and cities in general, you don't necessarily see that designation, and that's the beauty of it. We explained it earlier to Parcel A, how to make their parcel feel more inviting, urbane, and kind of seamless, right? And at the same time, though, successful urban spaces also have kind of this very well-crafted design language that is clear to people, and kind of there's a wonderful ambiguity to a degree that provides the richness of the experience, and then there's this clarity in the design that also delineates some boundaries that are a little bit more subtle and, you know, contribute to a more enjoyable experience. So, for example, you know, there's a difference between that path that's in front of the stoops there feeling like a public path, right? And so you're on that path, there's no bathrooms anywhere in range. Do you know where I'm going with this?
Yeah, yeah.
And 3 feet away, there's somebody's stoop right there. And I'm only saying this because it's happened at my stoop, you know, in the neighborhood in the city. People will sit on it, people will sleep on it, people will do whatever else they want and need to do right there on it, because it is so immediately next to a 5-foot sidewalk that you have simply no other place to go, right? So there's something about, that's the kind of ambiguity that I can see sometimes not working out really well for the residents and creating a lot of tension and a lot of conflict. Imagine a different neighborhood, and Baltimoreans will know it as Charles Village, or let's see who else has it in Hamden, all over Hamden, because topography is involved and it's actually used to that advantage. And I'm sure DC and other places have them too. But instead of like that very exposed stoop that just connects to a public sidewalk, all of a sudden has a little porch that's a few feet, that's like 2-3 feet elevated, right? And it has a little cover and whatnot. There's a difference if somebody comes into your porch to do anything like that, right? So what I'm trying to get at is that we have to design, as Kevin was saying, from the edge of the water all the way to the face of the building, and be very crafty and very thoughtful and very strategic about how we layer these elements so that there is no separation indeed between public and private, but there's no ambiguity, like that negative ambiguity of what should be happening where, or I don't feel comfortable being here because it's somebody else's door or something like that. There needs to be some kind of a understanding of what happens. And I also don't want to scare anybody, but there's a difference if a conflict like that happens on this side of the line and somebody thought that they were in a public park. Does that make sense also? Like there's like this other ambiguity about, well, you're not supposed to be doing all this. Well, what do you mean? I'm on the park, I'm on the trail, right? I can do whatever I want, or not whatever I want, but it's like there's the good ambiguity of urban space that is lovely and fluid and integrated, and there's the things that are not. So I think it's really important as a team with everybody to look very carefully through those things, because these compressed spaces simply don't offer 5 different sidewalks and like all of these transition zones and whatever. So it forces us to be that much more specific about what that happens. And ultimately, I think what you want to think about, and if we can jump back to the site plan then, is what do you want the character and the quality of this trail experience be? Like I'm absolutely in love with all of these different stops along the way that you've created that are really wonderful. But then I'm also realizing that along that whole path, unless I'm on a bike, my experience is those stoops.
Yeah.
And it's not like that's a bad thing or like that I wouldn't want to experience it, but it's like it's all of it is that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So to Sharon's point, maybe you would benefit from having more of the shared path and maybe only partially somewhere, having the stoop experience. And maybe it is a result of the compressions. Maybe that's how you find kind of where it's one and where it's the other, which will naturally start to give you a little bit more space. But I think between the concerns of kind of the undesirable blurring of some of these conditions and kind of the uniformity of the experience, I think is where the richness can start to emerge. And some of these modulations can happen. Back to the things I'm in love with. I like those spots along the plan that gather people are everything. To Osborne's point, this is the place where people will really feel they're on the water, and not just as an overlook, but there's programming, there's activation, there's like a different vibe to all of them, if you wish. So I think those are wonderful, and they're really special. Something we talked about with the developer earlier about those is that if the park was already built and they were coming to build their development, we would have asked them to use those as existing conditions and tell us how their plan is integrating with the existing conditions and aligning with all these view corridors and kind of reinforcing some of these spaces and blah, blah. The fact that they're not built right now doesn't mean, in fact, there's more of an opportunity for synergistically kind of aligning them and cross-programming them and being able to create more out of that. And so I want to share that with you because I think it's important. And if we can zoom in on a couple of those, I think in your renders currently, you're describing their experience purely as a relation to the water. And that's all you can do right now because it hasn't been coordinated to that next level. So our ask now is to start to look in that other direction and really consider that people may not be arriving on those just on the trail, but if we are to make this a very connected neighborhood and a very, go back to that first goal that we were discussing that we're not quite accomplishing yet, that these nodes need to work 360. This means that I see that right now you're trying to align them with stuff, and that's merely getting there. But I'm also curious about how they start to model the buildings. And how do they start to create, mini hierarchies within them? Because right now, and we talk to the developers about, it's like right now there's this relentless multiplication of 3 types of, attached dwellings, right? But all conditions are not the same, right? At some points you're arriving at this perch, at another point you're arriving at that perch. It can't all be the same behind it, right? So if we're talking about things being integrated, and I think those are the discussions and the modifications in the design that need to happen. And I think they need to be baked into the site plan in many ways, kind of through the alignment. I'm looking at number 13, that bridge arriving there, that experience, and that angle is everything. And yet you go 10 feet more, nope, well, we're back to the 8-foot trail with that one row house there on the corner, so what, nothing happened, right? That's what we're looking to see. This plan and the connection between the development and the park will not be complete until like these big moves and these ideas you've created in the landscape are not followed through in the neighborhood. We will continue to push with the developer to really start to show that on the plans, and we ask you, to the extent to which you're allowed and able to coordinate with them, to discuss with them ideas of how that can happen. In order to both strengthen the interventions that you're presenting and proposing, but also to allow for their design to become more rich and ultimately the entire project much better. So that's our ask, is to really start looking at it 360 and making suggestions of how that can impact some of the spaces that are immediately on the edge there. So lastly, I don't think we've spent much time on the wonderful Central Park you've designed, and I imagine that one will come back later in greater detail, but I just wanted to say that I love the idea of sort of like really exposing this movement of water through that gravel landscape. I think it's something that, because of the structural bulkhead throughout the city, people don't get to experience so much. Everyone hates that area in the Inner Harbor that floods, the little corner there. I always thought it was so fascinating because it's the only time you see the natural condition and the power of the water and its movement with like the various cycles and, you know, weather events that are happening. So to see it happen in a more naturalized setting like that is everything. I feel not only from an educational perspective, but from just the humanistic and quality of life perspective of like, we are actually seeing the reality of things rather than building more walls and just imagining like they're not there. So I think that's a really, you know, the fact that we can walk on it, or maybe it's not encouraged yet, is something to continue to contend with. You know, I realize it's a tension in the entire project, but the ability to at least see it and experience it kind of in a more natural way is really, really important. The direct connection to the water through that path is also great, and then allowing a more meandering kind of slower path through the park is also wonderful. One thing I am looking for is that when you first showed that slide, when you ideated with the community and, you know, people go, what do you want here? I want this and this, stickers, color blocks like this and this and that. And then they come up with a list of things. And then that list gets reduced to the most essential things. Is I know for a fact that, you know, a lot of the community is asking, and I saw it again, of these places. I mean, we're calling it like an event lawn, right? And, you know, whether it's a market or a this or a that, I'm wondering if you can kind of take another lens and go back and see not only how much are we accomplishing of the things that were on that list, because I don't think it's about volume, but rather about, are we capturing the essence of the request? Because I've seen these multi-use lawns and what can happen on them, and a whole lot of things can happen on them, you know, theoretically and by virtue of programming and access. But what I'm really questioning is like, if the community really was hoping for kind of a market and stuff like that, were they really thinking that this would be on a large lawn, kind of completely exposed, or is it really a little bit more of an intimate experience? And so what I'm asking for is then to go back to those and really see the extent to which these are accomplished in the plan. Is it really addressing kind of what they really need and what they would hope? And I know you'll get that feedback. I know that when you go back to your community engagement pieces, you know, I think it'll be important to follow up with people on that, because I see a lot of geometry, a lot of things happening in that number 11. I don't know exactly what happens there, but I feel like that's probably their biggest potential. That's the place where they can probably do the most things, because a lot of the other stuff is really about movement along the water, and it's very compressed. So I'd be curious to hear more about the programming of that space, about the different ways in which it meets the community's needs. That is one of the truly public spaces for gathering. And then similarly for the other portion, which is on the south end and with potentially the proposed new building there, I think it's important to also understand, you know, how much of the different activities and uses that the community might want in the future, and as it continues to grow, hopefully more residents and kind of economic development is spurred here, how much of this design can accommodate for some of those things. I think the idea of the anchor element there is huge. We know that every kind of major park place needs its steward, and having a great organization that anchors it really adds a lot. But I wonder if there's more synergy that can be had there with some of the other needs of the site. So, and it's probably already happening, and it's there. It's just once we get a chance to zoom to it, I think it'll be important to track that as well. So we are a little over time. There's so much to talk about. I think that, well, this won't be, of course, the last time we see this and we work with you, but we want to thank you for the fabulous work that is done. It's not easy. You have more hard work to do. And I think some of the items that we highlighted are probably a little bit more on the priority because it
Yep.
inform and affect how all of these other projects kind of develop. So just very quickly, I want to check with the rest of the panelists. Are there any additional questions? I mean, comments that came to mind since you spoke? I want to make sure that we cover everything.
I think, Pavelina, the Central Park, the mediation between the Central Park and the adjacent developments, that really needs some study.
Similarly.
I know the team presented two options, but I don't think you can go with either just yet. You have to work with the developer because you don't know whether or not you'd be fronting onto the backside of a home.
Yeah.
Is it a street? Is it just driveways? And the condition facing the north is very different to the condition facing the south because the condition at the south is literally the connection through to Wenbong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's something you'll need to give some attention to.
And I just actually wanted to second my very enthusiastic support that a pedestrian portion of the trail like really must occur on the public land. You know, if it didn't, even if you had a satisfactory one that was on the public side, you know, in 15 years, who knows, the developer might want to put like the low wrought iron gate and maybe you have residents complaining about, you know, public on land and you know, it's like becomes a contested space, right? We just want to avoid that at all costs. So anyways, we've talked to that, but just wanted to emphasize that.
Could I ask a follow-up kind of logistical question of the panel? Is there time for that, Paulina?
Yes, please go ahead.
So I really appreciate all the comments today. It's really fun to talk to other designers. So I really love this forum. Number one, I think I just want to, I had a kind of, maybe it's a procedural logistical question. Maybe it's just advice from this group. When we look at the section and we think about what we can do here, I agree, like we would love to continue exploring what can be done, and the idea of totally understand all the comments today about the pedestrian trail and all the thinking around that. Because of this constrained space we have, which the section really describes, you know, we're sort of working within this, as you see, the W2 zoning setback of 50 feet. Is that something that you think we could push on a little bit and get some variance for to like improve the circulation within the park space? We're just working in a very constrained area, and a lot of our design has been driven by those dimensional constraints, which are tied to city regulatory frameworks. So
yeah, I think that's a valid question. I think this is entirely in planning department's purview to answer it. Yeah, the panel, all we can do is offer comments that are hopefully helpful to you in a way of furthering the design. But your question is very valid, and I would say that on many projects, a lot of these kind of variances, modifications happen because of that, because the city is interested in the best design we can get. So the quick answer is yes, I think it's something you should absolutely discuss. What pathway there is to it and how possible it is, I think Ren and the rest of the team will be able to answer that more directly. But, you know, right now I agree with you. As I see it, is there enough room to put like a public trail there with all of its needs?
Right.
No, it's very constrained. Like, and if actually modifying the grading is pushed also on that side, because right now I can say, well, why is that townhouse not going half a level down and coming to grade, you know, with what you're working with there. But what I'm saying is that, yes, it's extremely constrained. And I think, you know, in order to fit the program and to really allow it to be what it needs to be, and I think planning can help you work through those subjects. Right, Ren? This is a good way to segue into planning. Yes, please take it away from here. Thank you all so much for your work and for your time today.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Yeah. Just wanted to say thanks to the team and thanks to the panel. I think it was a really robust discussion. To answer the question from field operations, and Megan, I think this is something that I'd love to work with you on. So we'll schedule a follow-up. I've got some notes I'll send to the team, and I think clearly we've heard that planning needs to do some more coordination between all of the project teams. It's something that we're working on, but we look forward to continuing it with all of you. So with that, we'll move on to our final project of the day.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you get some rest tonight. It's like an insane day for all of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay, I've just elevated Jennifer. Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to unmute so that you can help me with whom else from the team needs to be elevated to panelist.
Okay, let me do my best here. Well, we got Sally McConnell, Sarah Lindenfeld, Kristen Waltz, Harper. I think, and Kristen can chime in if there's others. I know there's probably others.
Wes Schwartz should also be pulled in too, please.
Great. And I elevated Olin, assuming that was the landscape on this.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Susan Weiler. Yes. And Greg Burrell, please.
Greg.
Yes, that's us.
Hi, everyone.
Okay.
Can you
Have we got everyone?
start our video?
If we've got the project team, I would just like to welcome everybody to the Urban Design and Architecture Advisory Panel. We're here for our final project of the day. This is a project on Johns Hopkins Hospital campus. And with that, I will hand it to Pavlina, who is our chair of UDAAP, to introduce the panel. And then the project team can go ahead and share screen and introduce their team and tell us about the project. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ren. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to UDAAP. I see some familiar faces. Others are perhaps new to it, but it's great to see you all. We look forward to seeing your project. As a matter of very quick housekeeping to Ren and the rest of the team, we're running a little bit behind, about 15, 20 minutes now. I normally leave more time at the end of our regularly scheduled time for overage, but today I really need to leave right at 4:30. So I'll be here to see a presentation. I'll offer my comments hopefully first, but I want to see, Osborne, if you would be willing to chair the rest of the meeting today so that I don't rush anybody else involved here. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right. Today with us are Sharon Bradley, landscape architect, Kevin Storm, architect planner, Osborne Anthony, architect and planner. The four of us will be reviewing your project. As a matter of just a quick schedule, it's nice to keep the presentation, the front end of it as short as possible. 20, 25 minutes usually works really well because it gives us a good overview of the breadth of your project. After that, we have a quick Q&A session where it allows us to kind of dig into a little bit of detail and finally offer our comments. So as you get started, please introduce your project team and then try to keep that front end of the presentation shorter. That would really help the flow of and keep us on time with this one. Without any further ado, please take it away.
Excellent. So I think I'm going to kick it off. Sally McConnell is on, but I don't think she can unmute. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to introduce our team. So first of all, thank you very much. My name is Kirsten Waltz. I'm the Vice President of Architecture and Planning for the Johns Hopkins Health System and the School of Medicine. We have here today Jennifer. I think you're well known, but would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, good afternoon. Jennifer Melke, Baltimore City Government Community Affairs.
Excellent. And Sarah, would you like to start off on the design team?
Sure. Sarah Lindenfeld, I'm managing principal on the project from Payette Architects.
And I'm Wesley Schwartz, also from Payette, associate principal on the project.
And Susan?
I'm Susan Weiler from Olin.
I'm Greg Burrell from Olin. Nice to meet you.
Excellent. So I'm going to kick it off here, and then I'm going to hand it off to the design team to do the overall presentation. But first of all, thank you very much for having us here today. We're here to introduce the Life Sciences building. The last time we were with you, it was for the CMSC building and for the School of Medicine entry plaza along Monument Street. This continues our journey along Monument Street to really enhance the public space, that public green space, as you'll see today. The building is located on the corner of Monument and Broadway. And I'm going to hand it off to Wes, who will walk you through the project. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. All right, so we will definitely try to keep this fairly brief for you guys so you have plenty of time to make comments. So as Kirsten mentioned, this is located on the Johns Hopkins East Baltimore campus, which is really just north of the Inner Harbor. And then more specifically within the campus, the project site is located at the intersection of Monument and Broadway, kind of on the northwest side of the campus. I mean, it is really right in the heart of the historical campus, but it kind of lives on the kind of northern edge of the kind of medical campus with housing just to the north. So here you can see sort of an aerial view of the existing buildings on the site. So just to the north of the image is the Billings, which is the kind of historic center of the medical campus. You can see to the left of this image is kind of the other major research buildings on the site. The Health Sciences Building is the CMSC project that is sort of nearing completion that Kirsten just mentioned. To the upper side of the site is the major kind of healthcare center of the campus, where what we will be presenting today is really a research project, but it is also kind of located adjacent to outpatient and other projects. So as we look at this site, you know, it's bounded by East Monument Street, which is a fairly major street running kind of to the east. It's a one-way street, and then Broadway is sort of the major two-way street that is really enhanced with kind of trees.
Wes, if I may
Go ahead.
interrupt for a minute, are you controlling the slideshow?
I am.
Are you able to move your mouse?
Yes.
Let's see if we can see it, because some of the text is very small on the drawings, and it'll be good if you can point to things that you're describing. Yeah,
I will
as
do
we
that.
go forward. Thank you.
No problem. So as we look at the existing site, this is located kind of at the intersection of Broadway and Monument, looking west, kind of down the hill. So this is a very steep site. You can see the existing building to the left, that is the project site. And to the right, you can start to see the kind of low rise to the north of the site. As we work down Monument Street, you can see the kind of existing housing that is on the opposite side of the street. And then looking up the hill to the east, you can see in the far background the sort of large research and healthcare buildings in the distance and the low-rise housing to the left. And then, you know, while the site is bounded by Broadway and Monument Street, kind of to the north and east, the south side of the site is bounded by McElderry Walkway, which is sort of a former street that was closed about 30 years ago to create a kind of pedestrian pathway up to the hospital. You can see the historic Billings building in the distance above this. As we look at the zoning on the site, it is located within the hospital zone with an allowable height of 218 feet. However, the residential zone the zoning area just to the north of the site defines a sort of a daylight plane that cuts through the site. So there's essentially a 40-foot building limit and then a 45-degree plane that limits the building to the north side of the site. So as we look at the kind of bulk massing of the building on the site, the building itself that we are proposing is about 166 feet tall. So it is much lower than the allowable height, and the massing of the building fully complies with the zoning envelope as it's laid out. We'll present shortly sort of how we've done that, but there's a series of sort of terracing along the north side of the building as well as on the south side that sort of builds the building down and kind of generates landscape spaces. So as we look at the overall site plan of the building, the LSB project is kind of located here. You can see there is two major research wings that are kind of oriented north-south along Broadway and then behind Armstrong. And then you can start to see that terracing of the building that kind of builds down to Monument Street and then builds down towards the kind of Billings and McElderry walkway. So one of our primary kind of concerns was how we start to build this new large building and kind of build it into the language of the existing site, and thinking about the historic Billings building and how we can start to have the building kind of participate in creating a large kind of urban room along Broadway. The existing outpatient building has a sort of cutout corner with a landscape space, and we're proposing a similar large cutout and kind of major landscape space along Broadway facing Billings. And then as we terrace the building down along Monument Street, we are proposing a fairly major landscape intervention to both deal with the slopes on the site as well as to soften the edge of the building. As we're looking at the site, we are also carefully studying the solar and performance of the building. And so this building is very much facing kind of directly east and west. So there are very high solar loads on the building on both the east and west elevations. And that really kind of builds into how we think about the building envelope and the design of the facades on the building. As we look at the kind of mass of the building, the sort of program is this is a life science building. And so the bulk of the building is research labs from level 2 through 6 with kind of major mechanical programs to support that research. And kind of the design of the building with the terracing and the to the north and the south is primarily clustered around collaboration spaces and other workspaces to the north and south of the building. And then the ground floor of the building is a sort of more slightly more public floor with the entrances, dining programs, and some conference spaces. And this building will support roughly 1,200 researchers in the building. So this is a pretty major research endeavor. So the building massing design is based on kind of taking the idea of these terracing layers, and we use that to also build out and break down the overall mass of the building. So the concept is really this idea of interlocking layers with 2 to 3 story layers that kind of build up with landscape terraces building up the building. So on the right-hand side is sort of facing Monument Street. You can start to see the major landscape space. And then we have large terraces both at level 3 and level 5 as you're building up the building. And we kind of make major massing breaks at those levels. And as we come over to McElderry and Broadway, we have sort of re-envisioned some of McElderry walkway up to a kind of major landscape space at the intersection of Broadway. And then again, that terracing kind of builds back and breaks down the massing of the building, working up from the ground. Again, a major reference point for the design of the project was the kind of historic Billings building, which is directly across from the site. And we've really worked carefully to kind of align major datums across from the existing Billings building into the thinking of the facades of our project and how we can start to break down the mass in similar ways to work together, create a very cohesive site. So here's the sort of view of our schematic design. This is essentially Billings is to your back. To the left, you're looking down McElderry walkway, and this is sort of along the facade, east facade along Broadway. you can start to see some of those terrace spaces, as well as the way the kind of interlocking massing breaks down the scale of the building. We're looking at sort of a more kind of bronze or copper colored base of the building, which ties more to some of the brick colors on the site, and a lighter bronzy tone on the upper part of the building to kind of lighten the mass of the building. From Monument Street, looking towards the kind of main entrance at the corner of Broadway and Monument Street, you can see down the hill, there's an existing bus stop that will be reinvigorated and kind of rethought a bit as the project develops. And here we've really stepped back the mass from Monument Street, and we are cantilevering the building above that to really open up the views and open up that connection to that new major landscape space. And here's a view kind of looking from more or less where that housing is along Monument Street to the north of the site, looking back at the building. Here you can see that major landscape space along Monument Street and the building kind of terracing up back away from Monument Street. So with that, that is primarily our building overview, and I will turn it over to Sue from Olin to talk through the landscape.
Great. Thanks. Nice to see you all again. Thanks for having us. You can see again, we were talking a little earlier about how we're really trying to start coagulating all of these spaces and really make the most out of the urban landscape that we can. You can see, of course, down at the hospital where we've been able to have some gardens, and then as you move up Broadway with this in front of buildings, we have this really major kind of open space. And then along Monument, as you know, with the School of Medicine courtyard, as we're working our way down Monument Street, really trying to improve this street and this relentless slope as people are moving through it. So you can see in context, in terms of the landscape, how we're sitting. Next, please. So one of the things about it is that on the Monument Street side and the McKeldry Street side, we have extreme slopes. So we're 25 feet of grade change on Monument Street from Broadway to the west, and likewise on McKeldry, we have 21-foot grade, and then we have extremely flat along Broadway. And so understanding these slopes and how people are pacing themselves and moving through them is kind of one of the challenges of the project that we're really quite enjoying. And as we go through the landscape, you can kind of see how we've set that up. Next, please. So we have landscape on every side of the building. We're trying to join it to the buildings. And along Monument Street, we'll look at that a little bit more carefully, where we have these step terraces. We have spaces adjacent to the building for exterior spaces, which would be on level 1. You can see them, Wes, maybe you can point them out. There we have these exterior spaces. Along Monument Street itself, we're really trying to create a more publicly comfortable space along there as people are moving through it. And then on McKeldry, we'll talk about that a little more specifically, and then trying to keep it relatively linear along Broad and between Broadway and Armstrong Building. Next, please. So again, with these elevational changes, it starts immediately as we're moving to the west. And so we're trying to carve out some spaces along here. The other thing that's happening is that on the left-hand side, you can see where the loading is. And so the space that requires, where we are there, it is where we have the most height, but we also have the least amount of distance from face of building to face of curb. where we have more area that we can work with in kind of this public domain is kind of as closer to Broadway and as we move down. And you can see that we're trying to create both for the bus stop, but also kind of these little insets that are really quite generous along there and then stepping up. And so that you're really feeling that this slope is making sense against the buildings. And again, you can also see kind of that the terraces outside of the building. Next, please. One of the things that we are really cognizant of is the views in and out, and also the scale on the other side of the street, being kind of understanding that there are a lot of viewpoints, both kind of east and west, and as people are moving up and down the street, it's a very dynamic movement of places and people, and also a lot of static views. And so we're trying to understand what those levels are, where there can be planting, where there should be views, keeping it open enough, and but still in areas where we do need some massing. Next. So you can see how we're moving down the street and then you can see how we're accommodating these terraces and some of these seating spaces along it. We have 2 or 3 major areas along the street, and this is one of them. So you can see how we're carving out views into the building and out of the building and trying to make that long slope walk a little bit more pleasant and dynamic. Next, please. There you can see looking in the other direction, we have some of these areas that we're able to cut out. We're trying to keep all of these terraces at a level that are human scale as well, and then setting them back and starting to get a flavor of what these would look like. Next. The other thing as we move to McKeldry Street, in our understanding of how we're trying to create accessibility wherever we can. We have accessible entrances at Broad and Monument Street, but one of the real, and also as it's pretty level, as you move to the south, we have very accessible entrance at that southeast corner adjacent to Billings. But one of the challenges is that excessive grade slope along McKeldry, and it is currently it's not fully compliant with American Disabilities Act. It works, and there's handrails where they need to be, but we thought we could do a lot better. And so what we did is that we are creating an accessible walk that moves all the way up. We have the speedway stairs along the southern portion of it, but we're trying to create a series of gardens along it as well. And I think we can probably see some images of that. So you can see in plan how we're kind of dealing with that. We're having these wonderful little spaces throughout it that you can kind of stop along your journey. You can sit there, these wonderful views up to buildings, a really generous entrance at this entrance to the building. And I think we have some perspectives of this. So you can see we're trying to keep the view, this historic view, very open, but we're really trying to make quite a different type of space along McKeldry than there currently is. Next. The overall planting strategy, I think you know us well enough that we're native BS as much as we can, but still really durable plants, and understanding where they would be there, and also in organization with kind of this calmer east and west side and more exuberant north and south side. And also we have some roof terraces that we're working with, but as you can imagine, the palette would be, you can see in these next series of slides. I don't think you would be surprised in any of our plant selection and our palettes. Next. I think in the kind of in that lower level in the shrub and the perennials and the grasses is where we can really get a lot of richness and seasonal interest and texture. Next. And then this is kind of that last view that we're trying to create quite a generous space in front of the building that is really just people can move very easily through it, but you can also stop in it. There's bosque of trees, a pretty simple design, but very complementary to the architecture of the building, to buildings, and to kind of the ensemble of the urban conditions that we have. And I think that is our last slide.
Yep, that's it.
Is that the end of the presentation?
Thank you very much.
That's it.
That is
Great.
the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. You're
That was
welcome.
indeed very efficient, very clear, very quick. It's very much appreciated. We might even end on time. I might be able to see the whole thing. Thank you all. Much appreciated. We'll have our Q&A real quick here to see if there's anything we want to clarify, but I just want to say, wow, what a transformative project, right? Speaking about transformation and really the commitment to, you know, looking at the buildings within the campus, but also the way they interface with the ground and with everything around it. I think we've had these conversations for several years now through various projects. And I think the one along up the street on Monument was one of those very first ones that was saying, you know, there will be greater transparency in the buildings. They will be touching the ground in a more interactive way. There will be access to like really rich outdoor space with native planting and all of that, which was so encouraging and so exciting. And it's really great to see the institution's commitment to really follow through on that with all of the future projects. I think there's another one just a couple of blocks up the street that also had similar sentiments. And I think it's really starting to transform this campus and this whole environment to something completely different and really looking into the future. So thank you all for the vision and for the effort and for the commitment indeed to bring such transformative projects to life. We'll have specific comments mostly with respect to kind of the big picture, the massing, the relationship to some of the pieces around there. And we look forward perhaps in the next presentation to see a little bit more specificity about, we normally don't get too deep into the building or its layout and, you know, its program, but I think the ground level use and some of the immediate uses kind of especially around the plazas and the entries and whatnot and how the entries are interacting and what's happening in that first floor is, I think, fair game in terms of understanding the porosity, the actual porosity of the building. You know, there's a lot of glass, which is wonderful. So it'll be great to see that in the next presentation. With that said, I just want to turn it over to the rest of the panel, and I don't have any clarifying questions. I think I got a good idea of what this is, but to see if they need a little bit more description on things. And I'd like to start with Osborne. Do you have any questions for the team?
No, not really. I mean, I think you answered it. The loading docks are off Monument, and they're kind of within that the lower portion of the site. So I think that's fine. The only other thing I probably would have asked, but actually I'm not going to even ask it. It was related to the entrances. We're fine. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Sharon, what are your questions for the team?
One super minor one, because the presentation was so very clear. The plants under the overhang, especially the ones where it's a quite low overhang near that main entrance. I assume there's irrigation and that the sun angles have been studied to make sure they're going to get adequate sun.
Yeah, well, and actually that cantilever is up actually pretty high.
Okay.
And yeah, and so we will. Yeah.
I figured. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Kevin, if you could, any questions for the team, and then please transition to your comments. We can work our way back.
Just two very quick questions. One is, actually, let's go to this. Can you just describe the ground floor uses close to the entrances and you know how you're seeing them sort of activate those terraces outside?
Sure. So starting from kind of the entrance at Monument, this is sort of a generous kind of entrance way with some seating along the glass. As we move in, there is actually on the west side, there's a sort of major kind of research core here. So that is actually a very transparent laboratory space with benches. And then there is also some breakout kind of sitting space along the glass. Along North Broadway, there's a sort of major conference room kind of suite. And so that is sort of the kind of first window along Broadway that also feeds into that kind of northern space. So we see this as sort of a forum space and breakout for that conference area with sort of a outdoor terrace. And then as we move along Broadway, the more southern half of this is more of a dining facility. So this is more like a kind of a larger kind of cafeteria dining area on the kind of southern side, more facing kind of the Billings area that will spill out into that southern space, kind of more on that south side. And then the rest of this large bar on the western side is all AI research space. It's sort of a dry research. It's a sort of a mix of different types of office and open and meeting spaces.
Thanks. And then and only one other quick question. I noticed in some of the renderings there was a fence. Could you maybe just trace on the site plan where exactly the fences are happening?
I think maybe in one of the perspectives you can actually see it a little better.
Yeah, you could see it
You can
mapped
see it there.
in this
Okay.
here. Yeah, and then you could
Yeah,
start to see.
and that kind of weaves in and out where we need the secured research spaces.
Yeah, so in plan that is kind of roughly from the end of the building here, kind of building kind of back.
And it undulates.
And it
Yeah.
sort of, yeah, it kind of comes back towards the building and then it sort of stops where the grades really drop off at the kind of loading dock.
Okay, so there's no public access
that
up to those upper terraces. It's like there's a clear separation.
Yeah, and so, really, these aren't really access spaces, but yeah, we're kind of trying to pull that fence back so it's really back within the landscape, not
Understood.
kind of
Yeah. And there's no
near the
fence
street.
on the other elevations, right, on the other sides?
There really are not any fences on the other sides. It is likely that this space kind of between Armstrong and the Life Science Building, that will likely be a sort of gated space that is not free access. But McElderry Walkway and the entire landscape along North Broadway, there's no fences on any of that.
Great, that's really helpful. I appreciate it. That's
Yep.
really all I had. The questions. I guess, I think I want to echo my colleagues' statements. It was a really clear and concise and well thought out presentation, and obviously a really transformative project. In terms of public space, I feel like you've really demonstrated kind of a deference to the interesting public spaces and the historic buildings around you, but you haven't let that kind of hinder kind of like your creativity and your shaping of the building and making something kind of stand on its own grounds and its own merits. So I really appreciate that. I think, again, I don't know how far along you are in your design, but I just want to make sure that you build in the places for people to put their bike, sort of like just that everyday kind of amenities that you might expect, this kind of campus around, for bike parking, or I don't know if your landscape, incorporates sort of like benches and seating out on the walkways kind of things.
Yeah.
So maybe you can respond to those too. I mean, maybe you already thought of all of those things.
Yeah, there's a lot of built-in seating, and then there is opportunity for additional movable, flexible furnishings, but there is a lot of built-in seating within it.
Great. No, that's good. And obviously, you're showing a lot of trees, which is nice and shady. There's going to be plenty of places for people to kind of sit comfortably in the outer months. It is in some ways, maybe it's a little bit of a missed opportunity not to have some kind of seating outside of your outdoor seating close to your dining facilities. I don't know if that's something that's possible or not seen as a big plus. But it seems like on nice days of the year, it might be nice to have that, or maybe it's easy enough for people to kind of just walk out to the Planet North there on those. And then I guess, if moving to the building itself, yeah, I'm intrigued by this kind of loose, sinuous kind of like it's not a super rigid, you're kind of being free with the kind of sinuous curves. You talked about breaking up the massing and in my view, like what you actually have kind of two slender towers, but in your treatment, you've actually like, in my opinion, you've kind of almost made the building look a little bit bigger than it is because you don't perceive like two masses with like a hyphen. You kind of perceive one big thing that becomes bigger. And I don't really have, I don't think that's necessarily anything wrong with it. I think it's a potential. Some might look at that and think that the building looks bigger because of that, especially with horizontality. But actually, I think it's kind of interesting. I think that the terraces that you were showing stepping back, I think you maybe exploit a little bit more with greenery and things, as long as you're staying within the realm of reality in some of the renderings to make that case. I also think that you did these solar studies and energy analysis. I'd be curious to know, to see as your spin develops, like how it might sort of subtly change or morph with a kind of looseness that might be, analogous to the looseness of your kind of sinuous curves and geometry. It's like how you might treat the facade and skin maybe differently to address some of the energy, the different energy loads as it moves around. And maybe you've done some of that already, and I'm just not totally wasn't oriented when I saw all the renderings, but I think that seems like a really, a great opportunity to kind of, it looks like you have your fins, but it looks like they're maybe similarly dimensioned and similar depths around the building. But I think that's a great opportunity for you to kind of begin to kind of have the building change as it moves around, and depending on real performance metrics.
Wes, do you want to just go briefly through what we've done?
Sure.
For
Yeah.
the solar
No.
studies?
I think there is. Yeah, these views don't probably show all the complexity because we're obviously continuing to work on the design. But yeah, there is some variation where there's greater depth, and there's also sort of panels built in, some opaque panels on the east and west facades. And then, we are trying to kind of tie the language across the building, so it is a very cohesive thing. So you don't see the performance is a little bit hidden, where the fins will start to get smaller and larger depending on the orientations and the solar. So like under the cantilever, it starts to get shallower as that's sort of shaded by the upper mass. And so there is, I'd say, it doesn't become highly overt. It is definitely built into how we're thinking and tuning the systems, but it's much more in the tuning level, where we're trying to make sure we don't kind of lose the cohesiveness of the building as we start to do those moves. Yeah. But we can share more and actually share some of the very technical diagrams where you can see how we're kind of adjusting panels and depths and things to actually get those performance metrics based on the different spaces too.
Thanks. I think that's all I have for now. Maybe some other thoughts might occur to me as I hear my colleagues. Maybe pass it on.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. I'll offer my comments next and then pass it on to Sharon, and then maybe Osborne, you can close out the meeting. This way there's no rush to end right at 4:30, and I think others can chime in if there's anything else left at the end. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a really strong, recognizable, just cohesive, like you used that word a few times just now, approach to the site. It's exciting because it is a departure from the other things that are on the campus, from the very historic and traditional buildings to some of the, now 30, 40-year-old buildings, and even to some of the newer things that we've seen that come about. And it's really great to see kind of that ability to bring something fresh and new, try to integrate it and tie it in some visual ways to at least the color and material language around, but really not hesitate to bring new forms and new types of architecture to the campus. So kudos for that. I think it's a very strong proposal. I'd like to start on the other side if possible. I think one of the strongest parts of the design is, of course, this terraced form. And I think this view and this move here on Monument is just really quite exciting, you know, from a pedestrian perspective. And I realized that there is no program coming down to the ground, but there are well-proportioned, you know, kind of exterior spaces and the terraces and the landscape, which I know for a fact will be a very much needed respite along Monument, and really start to create this experience as you go to the next block, and then you start to encounter that other outdoor gathering space. It's just in keeping with this much more humane and soft edge. I like how the landscape and the architecture are speaking the same language. That's really refreshing to see. And in fact, it's on this side where one can really read that striation and layering of the architecture, the landscape architecture, and then the building architecture. There's this cohesion that we're talking about. I start to lose it a little bit when we go to the other side. So if we can now switch to the other view of it, both because the scale of the building changes. So less than a layered approach here, it seems like either a large mass that is getting a little bit of differentiation and a little bit of articulation by pushing certain faces and popping other faces out, mostly because some of the masses now become kind of taller, right? So on the other side, it was reading a little bit more as a 3, 4, 5, 6 different layers because of the landscape, and then the smaller mass is stacked. On this side, it's starting to read less as that kind of layered language and more as a single mass that perhaps is pushed and pulled and carved a little bit. So from that point of view, I also am reminded then that perhaps that's okay, and perhaps the read that the building has on this side should be a little bit different than the read that it has on the other side, because it's responding to very different conditions. I think the layered approach to the landscape and the building came from the conditions of the site, this very sloped, you know, kind of surface, and then the building just growing out of the ground into it. When we come to this side, we're in a completely different realm. Not only are we facing a very historic building, very formal, right, within its landscape and within its architecture, but also this entire Broadway experience has this very different read, very perspectival. When you were showing the pictures of the two elevations of the old building and the new building, kind of aligning lines, I appreciate the effort of doing that, but that is not how the buildings will be read together. So I'm much more interested in a view that is standing a little bit south on Broadway, and it's looking, you know, if you turn to the right, so we're actually seeing the two buildings together. I think that is a very useful study to make. And I'm not necessarily looking for alignments per se. You know, the historic building is pushed pretty deep in from the road, whereas this one is much closer. So I don't think you will have that read ever, but I am curious to see how the mass of this building integrates with this like very iconic view that we have right now. Every time you go up on Broadway and you come to this portion of the campus with its like very intimate scale of the experience, and then the historic building pushed in, I'm curious to see how this addition starts to integrate with that. But because of that, I feel like perhaps a little bit more formality and a little bit more, how should I say it? Communication or dialogue with the building across, and just with the more traditional makeup of this portion of the site is warranted. So it's not just in the architecture, I think it's also in the landscape architecture. So if you look at the site plan, I'm a little bit concerned about the secondary circle that is being introduced, and it's misaligned. It's sort of off alignment with this other very strong form. And don't get me wrong, I'm not at all criticizing the design. I'm just recognizing the tension within the design, and I'm asking you to study it, and perhaps maybe with additional views, really just to see, will that addition of this round plaza that is off of this like really strong axis, and like on one side you have this iconic building, right? You showed us that perspective, and now you with the McElderry walkway, that's going to be transformed. All of a sudden, there's this outdoor space that spurs off, that kind of follows a similar geometry, but it's like completely off that axis. And I start to worry a little bit that instead of really dialoguing with the kind of this formal kind of organization of the site, we're starting to just dilute it a little bit, to just do things to it. I don't have any suggestions or recommendations or solutions to this, but I recognize it as a tension that perhaps is undermining what could be a very powerful experience, both from a landscape and from a building perspective. Right now, that circle still feels secondary and inferior to the primary one because of its formality is so much more overpowering, making this one feel somewhat secondary, somewhat busy, somewhat like, self-conscious almost in a way, because it's calling for attention, because it's breaking things up, and it's like, oh, and there's the circle here, come hang out over there. So I'm wondering if there's an approach that both recognizes the formality of this space and the building that anchors it on one end, but also starts to introduce kind of a space of its own that isn't necessarily in conflict with some of this. I was going to jump into Google really quickly to see what the character of the space is outside of the Levi Watkins Outpatient Center. I'm not sure what that landscape is doing, but it's almost like that whole space needs to be looked in totality. And then with these important view alignments to see how exactly they interact with the formal, historic, there it is, right there. So I think, that needs to be thought of completely with the circle, with the oval on the other side, with that building, just to make sure that we're preserving to a degree kind of the formality of the space, but we're also not undermining the power of the new building and landscape and what they're trying to do. To that extent, I was wondering, as you read the architecture and the landscape from the north side, and you can call the language both ways, but let me explain kind of exactly what I mean. From there, that layered experience, I would call it additive, because it seems like it starts with a layer and then it adds another layer and steps back, but it's sort of the building recedes as you're moving away from it. On this other corner, it seems to me like there is an opportunity to have a volume that's a little bit more defined and proud, in which perhaps then the outdoor space is carved into. So instead of replicating the language that's on the other side, but to a lesser degree, I wonder if it can be used kind of, if that was the additive side, here it can be more subtractive. So it could read as if this is one volume and the outdoor plaza space is indeed carved into it in a similar striated fashion. That is only if we really want to reinforce that language, but right now it's moving in the direction to where it's sort of like a curved facade of three parts. So something to consider, and would love to see kind of a study, and perhaps it's more views both for the landscape, but then for the building, of how this can have a recognizable language, so that it's cohesive, as you're saying, with the rest of the building, but it's not just using a kind of a simplified, watered down version of the big concept. And I'm also very excited about the skin and its opportunity in terms of both of its materiality and tonality, but also its performance. I think that's a really great opportunity for the building to continue to work in this really cohesive way. And I'm also curious to see a bit more detail on how that's getting articulated. I think Kevin was asking earlier about the various uses around the site on the ground level. I think that will be also nice to dive into next time and see a little bit more of an enlargement around the entries in particular, and where that interfacing happens with the exterior spaces and along McKelderry as well. The last thing I will say is that, in kind of support of what I'm asking for here, is, if the north part of the building has this really powerful concept that is so clear and so well articulated, and perhaps the south part is following it to a degree, but it lacks that same clarity of articulation. What right now in my mind is happening is that you don't really know which one is the primary entry of the building. Is it the north one or is it the south one? So I'm wondering, and that might not even be relevant. Maybe there are two primary entries. I don't know. But I think it's worth kind of asking that question and really understanding, is there a hierarchy between the different parts of the building and particularly the two main entries? And if so, how can we express that more clearly? That's the extent of my comments. Thank you again for a fabulous start to this project. I'll listen to the rest of it, but otherwise I would hand it over to Sharon Bradley, who can offer her comments, and then Osborne, who can close out the meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pavlina. As a landscape architect, I love seeing a strong expression of landscape and having it work with such strength alongside the building. And it also serves here, as you can see on the image that's on the screen now, to bring some of the heavily landscaped areas that set back off of Monument Street and draws it out and across on Monument Street. So it really serves an important function of almost creating a park system here that the building nestles into. I also applaud the attention to the views from the building because often that is neglected, and the building is just seen as an object to be seen, to be appreciated only. The landscape is appreciated only from the outside, whereas we know a lot of these places are inhabited by people who need to see and experience and benefit by the natural elements. And so this does this very well, celebrates the landscape and its impact on people inside the building. Echoing some of Pavlina's comments on that northern edge, the terraced hillside, which it's providing, as I said, a biophilic park-like experience even on a busy street. And the geometries are consistent with the building form, and it allows the expression on the facade to flow out into the landscape and create a cohesive whole. So that composition really speaks well on Monument Street. The terraces are human scale. So again, the manipulation of the grade in the third dimension is done with sensitivity to the pedestrian experience on the street. Like the intentional carving out of a space that's habitable for bus stop. We often don't see that, where people are just sort of standing out and in the flow of pedestrian traffic waiting for a bus. This actually provides a nook that is actually pleasant to be in when taking public transportation. Looking at the McElderry walkway, of course, an ADA compliant route is necessary, vital in a medical setting like this. So making it very intentional and actually a pleasant journey as well as being an accessible route, I think is successful here in providing those pause points. And again, a park-like experience as you're moving through the space. So I don't feel like people navigating through that space and that change in grade will feel other than as some ADA compliant routes do. This feels very intentional and inclusive, and I could see myself taking that route, preferring that route over the direct stairs. So that's always what we aim for, is providing an equal or better than experience for ADA compliant routes.
I will add it not only is it compliant, but it is a sloped walk.
Perfect. Yeah. So not even the handrails and
Exactly.
true
Yeah.
ramps, even better.
Yeah.
And then it does become a journey, a pleasant journey through a park, rather than a set of switchbacks in a back door. So I love the intentionality of that. The four-season interest of the plant palette, and that layered approach again on Monument Street, where you've created a canvas there. So plant selection is going to be really critical so that there are no downtimes in the season, since you have created this vertical palette. So good luck.
Thank you.
Also, I've noted that sightlines are preserved here, always important in an urban situation, and that the plant selections are kept fairly low. So you have a tree canopy and then a fairly low level of that. So septed principles definitely observed here. Something out on Broadway, I'm assuming I saw in the rendering some fencing for foot traffic control. It seems like it'll be necessary here. And also dog control. So presumably that will happen there. So it happens naturally with that tiered set of walls. You've got a monument, but the same will have to happen in the other areas as well, just to make sure those areas are preserved. And then finally, just wanted to note too that and I hope this continues through the evolutions of this design, this addition of multiple places to be in the spaces. Lots of different scales of spaces, lots of different types of sitting opportunities. And so regardless of what the need is or the desire is, there are a lot of opportunities to be outside in a lot of different ways. And so appreciate that low walls, planter walls, cafe tables, again, providing intentional, definite places for people to pause outside and appreciate the natural setting. So hopefully that gets retained in the pushing and pulling of an evolving design. And with that, thanks. I'll hand it back off to Osborne.
Thanks, Sharon. So I don't have a lot of comments because I really think that the project is nicely handled. There's a certain amount of care, and I would even say exploration, that has gone into the design. So I think in that regard, it's successful. I think there are a lot of things that the design team has done, certainly very thoughtful. And in many ways, it's kind of like when you think of the buildings that are even recent buildings that have been built on the Hopkins campus, they kind of convey a very sort of not rigid, but orderly and orthodox way of putting together institutional type buildings. But I think what's welcoming about this one is it takes on a kind of an organic framework to it. And in many respects, it's almost like a welcomed counterpoint to what's in the building, right? When you think about it, you're doing research, it's a life sciences building. There's a kind of a rigid and rigor that's associated with that kind of a program, but yet you found, uh, the ability to express a little bit more freedom in terms of its massing, and certainly complemented by the elegance of the landscape and hardscape, and how it really begins to mediate between, the very challenging site in terms of the grades dropping off, within half of a block, 25 feet. Whoa. Okay. That's a lot to deal with. But again, you've been able to really work through that in a very crafty and clever manner. I think in many respects, the question that Pavlina raised at the end was actually the question I was going to ask. But then I thought about it very quickly and I said, nah, well, maybe let's not ask this question about the entrance, simply because I think I came to an answer myself, and I may be wrong, right? But you can make the argument that, well, you can enter the building either from Monument and Broadway, or you can literally enter from Broadway and McElderry, simply because that spine, that connection back to Billings, there's a certain history associated with that that's celebrated. There's a kind of a formality that's associated with that as well, to the extent where I think that little square in the middle of Broadway is actually the entrance to the metro, right?
It is.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
so there's a kind of a natural argument that one can make that this sort of McElderry Walk is so there's so much heritage and history associated with that. How could you not have somewhat of an important entry point off of that? So I think in that regard, that decision, in my opinion, is well received. I think the challenge is, which is what Pavlina was reacting to, scribing that kind of elliptical circle in the ground plane is a little bit too much. It's over the top. It's one of those cases where you're probably looking at all the, excuse my French here, the sexy curves and so forth within the building, the beautiful shapes that come out of, something that's so graceful. And you kind of, well, let's really put it into the ground, but I don't think you really need to. I think, if anything, more than anything else, you need to reinforce the strong linear element that connects back to Billings. And how you do that with paving, I think you can do that very successfully, but I really don't think there's a need to kind of go through and create that sort of elliptical scribe, at the ground plane.
Yeah, we have an expression around here that circles are bossy.
I'm wondering who's saying that. I won't ask. But I think, yeah, but I think, in regards to even how you've kind of negotiated the massing and organized the massing, I think it's very clever. Certainly it's fluid, and all sides of the building are not the same. You respect the kind of very linear element and the powerful north-south axis of Broadway. So the facade that fronts onto that is somewhat reflective of that. Similarly, the facade that looks to the Armstrong building is certainly more rectilinear and in keeping to some extent with what you expect of the overall Hopkins campus. I do agree with Pavlina, though. That entrance off of McElderry, somehow the massing, as you bring it around, because you're striving so hard to keep that sense of fluidity and grace, that you bring in the entire massing around. Somehow you've got to look for a way to modulate that, and maybe we can go to the three-dimensional views or even the massing views that you kind of created. Yeah, you can see it begins to dilute the balance or the what I call the graceful tension in terms of how these forms are moving and negotiate in the corners. When you kind of look at it in a vertical, from a vertical standpoint, it's too symmetrical, right? If you understand where I'm going. So I think one mass potentially needs to either be elevated or compressed so that there's a little bit more graceful tension existing as you kind of look at this building from this vantage point. I do agree that the monument and the monument facade or the monument vantage is way more successful, but much of that is probably a byproduct of the fact that the grades are sloping so significantly. I do like the materiality that's being expressed here and the fact that it's changing as you kind of go around the building. The only other point that I will make, though, is the way the glazing terminates in these belt courses. It almost has a hint of classes. Oh, I can't say the word properly now, but it has a kind of a classical feel to it, which is actually welcoming. But as you kind of go into the details, you don't want to overdo that because then it begins to appear as though you're mimicking something from the past. And I think that can be very dangerous. So you have to look for a very subtle way to kind of transition that. So I think those are my comments. Kudos to the team. Thank you all. I think it's a wonderful project. Certainly, as always, Hopkins never surprises. And I think part of that comes with your selection of consultants to really pull these very complex but thoughtful projects together. With that, I'm not sure. Let's see if the panel has any additional comments. Oh, Pavlina, you're still here. I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, no, it's quite okay. I was lucky to be able to hear the rest of it. So I'm just here for the ride. No, thank you all for the presentation. Please, the rest of the panel, if they have any questions, otherwise we'll hand it over to planning.
Hearing none, just wanted to thank the project team and the panel. It's been a full day for us, and we appreciate the project team giving us a really succinct, clear presentation. I've taken some notes, and Antoine Heath, who's not with us today, he's on vacation, will be circling back with the project team on next steps, but I will send the draft notes in the meantime. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you. The next UDAAP is going to be on October 24th, and we'll see everybody then.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your comments.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.